Lord Jim, by Joseph Conrad, chapters 27 and 28. Chapter 27. Already the legend had gifted him with supernatural powers. Yes, it was said, there had been many ropes cunningly disposed, and a strange contrivance that turned by the efforts of many men, and each gun went tearing slowly through the bushes, like a wild pig rooting its way in the undergrowth. But, and the wisest shook their heads, there was something occult in all this, no doubt. For what is the strength of ropes and men's arms? There is rebellious soul in things which must be overcome by powerful charms and incantations. Thus old Sura, a very respectable householder of Patusan, with whom I had a quiet chat one evening. However, Sura was a professional sorcerer also, who attended all the rice-sowings and reapings for miles around for the purpose of subduing the stubborn souls of things. This occupation he seemed to think a most arduous one, and perhaps the souls of things are more stubborn than the souls of men. As to the simple folk of outlying villages, they believed and said, as the most natural thing in the world, that Jim had carried the guns up the hill on his back, 2 at a time. This would make Jim stamp his foot in vexation, and exclaim with an exasperated little laugh, "What can you do with such silly beggars? They will sit up half the night talking bally rot, and the greater the lie, the more they seem to like it." You could trace the subtle influence of his surroundings in this irritation. It was part of his captivity. The earnestness of his denials was amusing, and at last I said, "My dear fellow, you don't suppose I believe this?" He looked at me quite startled. "Well, no, I suppose not," he said, and burst into a Homeric peal of laughter. "Well, anyhow, the guns were there, and went off all together at sunrise. Jove! You should have seen the splinters fly," he cried. By his side Dain Waris, listening with a quiet smile, dropped his eyelids and shuffled his feet a little. It appears that the success in mounting the guns had given Jim's people such a feeling of confidence that he ventured to leave the battery under the charge of 2 elderly Bugis who had seen some fighting in their day, and went to join Dain Waris and the storming party, who were concealed in the ravine. In the small hours they began creeping up, and when 2/3 of the way up, lay in the wet grass waiting for the appearance of the sun, which was the agreed signal. He told me with what impatient, anguishing emotion he watched the swift coming of the dawn, how, heated with the work and the climbing, he felt the cold dew chilling his very bones, how afraid he was he would begin to shiver and shake like a leaf before the time came for the advance. "It was the slowest half-hour of my life," he declared. Gradually the silent stockade came out of the sky above him. Men scattered all down the slope were crouching amongst the dark stones and dripping bushes. Dain Waris was lying flattened by his side. "We looked at each other," Jim said, resting a gentle hand on his friend's shoulder. "He smiled at me as cheery as you please, and I dared not stir my lips for fear I would break out into a shivering fit. 'Pon my word, it's true. I had been streaming with perspiration when we took cover, so you may imagine—" He declared, and I believe him, that he had no fears as to the result. He was only anxious as to his ability to repress these shivers. He didn't bother about the result. He was bound to get to the top of that hill and stay there, whatever might happen. There was no going back for him. Those people had trusted him implicitly, him alone, his bare word. I remember how, at this point, he paused with his eyes fixed upon me. As far as he knew, they never had an occasion to regret it yet, he said. Never. He hoped to God they never would. Meantime, worse luck, they had got into the habit of taking his word for anything and everything. I could have no idea. Why, only the other day an old fool he had never seen in his life came from some village miles away to find out if he should divorce his wife. Fact, solemn word, that's the sort of thing. He wouldn't have believed it. Would I? squatted on the veranda, chewing betel nut, sighing and spitting all over the place for more than an hour, and as glum as an undertaker before he came out with that dashed conundrum. That's the kind of thing that isn't so funny as it looks. What was a fellow to say? Good wife? Yes, good wife. Old, though. Started a confounded long story about some brass pots. Been living together for 15 years, 20 years, could not tell. A long, long time. Good wife. Beat her a little. Not much, just a little, when she was young. Had to, for the sake of his honor. Suddenly, in her old age, she goes and lends 3 brass pots to her sister's son's wife, and begins to abuse him every day in a loud voice. His enemies jeered him. His face was utterly blackened. Pots totally lost. Awfully cut up about it. Impossible to fathom a story like that. Told him to go home and promised to come along myself and settle it all. It's all very well to grin, but it was the dashest nuisance. A day's journey through the forest, another day lost, and coaxing a lot of silly villagers to get at the rights of the affair. There was the making of a sanguinary shindy in the thing. Every bally idiot took sides with one family or the other, and one half of the village was ready to go for the other half with anything that came handy. Honour bright, no joke, instead of attending to their bally crops. Got him the infernal pots back, of course, and pacified all hands. No trouble to settle it, of course not. Could settle the deadliest quarrel in the country by crooking his little finger. The trouble was to get at the truth of anything. Was not sure to this day whether he had been fair to all parties. It worried him. And the talk! Jove, there didn't seem to be any head or tail to it. Rather storm a 20-foot-high old stockade any day. Much. Child's play to that other job. Wouldn't take so long either. Well, yes, a funny set-out upon the whole. The fool looked old enough to be his grandfather. But from another point of view it was no joke. His word decided everything, ever since the smashing of Sherif Ali. An awful responsibility, he repeated. No, really, joking apart. Had it been 3 lives instead of 3 rotten brass pots, it would have been the same. Thus he illustrated the moral effect of his victory in war. It was, in truth, immense. It had led him from strife to peace, and through death into the innermost life of the people. But the gloom of the land spread out under the sunshine preserved its appearance of inscrutable, of secular repose. The sound of his fresh young voice, it's extraordinary how very few signs of wear he showed, floated lightly and passed away over the unchanged face of the forest, like the sound of the big guns on that cold dewy morning when he had no other concern on earth but the proper control of the chills in his body. With the first slant of sun rays along these immovable tree-tops, the summit of one hill wreathed itself with heavy reports in white clouds of smoke, and the other burst into an amazing noise of yells, war-cries, shouts of anger, of surprise, of dismay. Jim and Dain Waris were the first to lay their hands on the stakes. The popular story has it that Jim, with a touch of one finger, had thrown down the gate. He was, of course, anxious to disclaim this achievement. The whole stockade, he would insist on explaining to you, was a poor affair. Sherif Ali trusted mainly to the inaccessible position, and anyway the thing had already been knocked to pieces and only hung together by a miracle. He put his shoulder to it like a little fool and went in head over heels. Jove, if it hadn't been for Dain Waris, a pock-marked tattooed vagabond would have pinned him with his spear to the baulk of timber like one of Stein's beetles. The third man in, it seems, had been Tamb' Itam, Jim's own servant. This was a Malay from the north, a stranger who had wandered into Patusan and had been forcibly detained by Rajah Allang as paddler of one of the state boats. He had made a bolt of it at the first opportunity, and finding a precarious refuge, but very little to eat, amongst the Bugis settlers, had attached himself to Jim's person. His complexion was very dark, his face flat, his eyes prominent and injected with bile. There was something excessive, almost fanatical, in his devotion to his white lord. He was inseparable from Jim like a morose shadow. On state occasions he would tread on his master's heels, one hand in the haft of his kriss, keeping the common people at a distance by his truculent, brooding glances. Jim had made him the headman of his establishment, and all Patusan respected and courted him as a person of much influence. At the taking of the stockade he had distinguished himself greatly by the methodical ferocity of his fighting. The storming party had come on so quick, Jim said, that, notwithstanding the panic of the garrison, there was a hot 5 minutes of hand-to-hand inside that stockade, till some bally ass set fire to the shelters of boughs and dry grass, and we had to clear out for dear life. The rout, it seems, had been complete. Doramin, waiting immovably in his chair on the hillside, with the smoke of the guns spreading slowly above his big head, received the news with a deep grunt. When informed that his son was safe and leading the pursuit, he, without another sound, made a mighty effort to rise. His attendants hurried to his help, and, held up reverently, he shuffled with great dignity into a bit of shade, where he laid himself down to sleep, covered entirely with a piece of white sheeting. In Patusan the excitement was immense. Jim told me that from the hill, turning his back on the stockade, with its embers, black ashes, and half-consumed corpses, he could see time after time the open spaces between the houses on both sides of the stream fill suddenly with a seething rush of people, and get empty in a moment. His ears caught feebly from below the tremendous din of gongs and drums. The wild shouts of the crowd reached him in bursts of faint roaring. A lot of streamers made a flutter as of little white, red, and yellow birds amongst the brown ridges of roofs. "You must have enjoyed it," I murmured, feeling the stir of sympathetic emotion. It was immense, immense!" he cried aloud, flinging his arms open. The sudden movement startled me, as though I had seen him bare the secrets of his breast to the sunshine, to the brooding forest, to the steely sea. Below us the town reposed in easy curves upon the banks of a stream whose current seemed to sleep. "Immense," he repeated for a third time, speaking in a whisper, for himself alone. Immense! No doubt it was immense. The seal of success upon his words, the conquered ground for the soles of his feet, the blind trust of men, the belief in himself, snatched from the fire, the solitude of his achievement. All this, as I've warned you, gets dwarfed in the telling. I can't with mere words convey to you the impression of his total and utter isolation. I know, of course, he was in every sense alone of his kind there, but the unsuspected qualities of his nature had brought him into such close touch with his surroundings that this isolation seemed only the effect of his power. His loneliness added to his stature. There was nothing within sight to compare him with, as though he had been one of those exceptional men who can only be measured by the greatness of their fame. And his fame, remember, was the greatest thing around for many a day's journey. You would have to paddle, pole, or track a long weary way through the jungle before you passed beyond the reach of its voice. Its voice was not the trumpeting of the disreputable goddess we all know, not blatant, not brazen. It took its tone from the stillness and gloom of the land without a past, where his word was the one truth of every passing day. It shared something of the nature of that silence through which it accompanied you into unexplored depths, heard continuously by your side, penetrating, far-reaching, tinged with wonder and mystery on the lips of whispering men. Chapter 28. The defeated Sharif Ali fled the country without making another stand, and when the miserable hunted villagers began to crawl out of the jungle back to their rotting houses, it was Jim who, in consultation with Dain Waris, appointed the headmen. Thus he became the virtual ruler of the land. As to old Tunku Allang, his fears at first had known no bounds. It is said that at the intelligence of the successful storming of the hill he flung himself face down on the bamboo floor of his audience hall, and lay motionless for a whole night and a whole day, uttering stifled sounds of such an appalling nature that no man dared approach his prostrate form nearer than a spear's length. Already he could see himself driven ignominiously out of Patusan, wandering, abandoned, stripped, without opium, without his women, without followers, a fair game for the first comer to kill. After Sherif Ali his turn would come, and who could resist an attack led by such a devil? And indeed he owed his life and such authority as he still possessed at the time of my visit to Jim's idea of what was fair alone. The Bugis had been extremely anxious to pay off old scores, and the impressive old Doramin cherished the hope of yet seeing his son ruler of Patusan. During one of our interviews he deliberately allowed me to get a glimpse of this secret ambition. Nothing could be finer in its way than the dignified wariness of his approaches. He himself, he began by declaring, had used his strength in his young days, but now he had grown old and tired. With his imposing bulk and haughty little eyes darting sagacious inquisitive glances, he reminded one irresistibly of a cunning old elephant. The slow rise and fall of his vast breast went on powerful and regular like the heave of a calm sea. He too, as he protested, had an unbounded confidence in Tuan Jim's wisdom. If he could only obtain a promise, one word would be enough. His breathing silences, the low rumblings of his voice, recalled the last efforts of a spent thunderstorm. I tried to put the subject aside. It was difficult, for there could be no question that Jim had the power. In his new sphere there did not seem to be anything that was not his to hold or to give. But that, I repeat, was nothing in comparison with the notion which occurred to me while I listened with a show of attention, that he seemed to have come very near at last to mastering his fate. Doramin was anxious about the future of the country, and I was struck by the turn he gave to the argument. The land remains where God had put it, but white men, he said, they come to us, and in a little while they go. They go away. Those they leave behind do not know when to look for their return. They go to their own land, to their people, and so this white man too would. I don't know what induced me to commit myself at this point by a vigorous "No, no." The whole extent of this indiscretion became apparent when Doramin, turning full upon me his face, whose expression, fixed in rugged deep folds, remained unalterable like a huge brown mask, said that this was good news indeed, reflectively, and then wanted to know why. His little motherly witch of a wife sat on my other hand, with her head covered and her feet tucked up, gazing through the great shutter-hole. I could only see a straying lock of grey hair, a high cheek-bone, the slight masticating motion of the sharp chin. Without removing her eyes from the vast prospect of forests stretching as far as the hills, she asked me in a pitying voice why it was that he, so young, had wandered from his home, coming so far through so many dangers. Had he no household there, no kinsman in his own country? Had he no old mother who would always remember his face? I was completely unprepared for this. I could only mutter and shake my head vaguely. Afterwards, I am perfectly aware I cut a very poor figure trying to extricate myself out of this difficulty. From that moment, however, the old nakhoda became taciturn. He was not very pleased, I fear, and evidently I had given him food for thought. Strangely enough, on the evening of that very day, which was my last in Patusan, I was once more confronted with the same question, with the unanswerable why of Jim's fate. And this brings me to the story of his love. I suppose you think it is a story that you can imagine for yourselves. We have heard so many such stories, and the majority of us don't believe them to be stories of love at all. For the most part we look upon them as stories of opportunities, episodes of passion at best, or perhaps only of youth and temptation, doomed to forgetfulness in the end, even if they pass through the reality of tenderness and regret. This view mostly is right, and perhaps in this case too. Yet I don't know. To tell this story is by no means so easy as it should be, were the ordinary standpoint adequate. Apparently it is a story very much like the others. For me, however, there is visible in its background the melancholy figure of a woman, the shadow of a cruel wisdom buried in a lonely grave, looking on wistfully, helplessly, with sealed lips. The grave itself, as I came upon it during an early morning stroll, was a rather shapeless brown mound with an inlaid neat border of white lumps of coral at the base, and enclosed within a circular fence made of split saplings with the bark left on. A garland of leaves and flowers was woven about the heads of the slender posts, and the flowers were fresh. Thus, whether the shadow is of my imagination or not, I can at all events point out the significant fact of an unforgotten grave. When I tell you, besides, that Jim with his own hands had worked at the rustic fence, you will perceive directly the difference, the individual side of the story. There is in his espousal of memory and affection belonging to another human being something characteristic of his seriousness. He had a conscience, and it was a romantic conscience. Through her whole life the wife of the unspeakable Cornelius had no other companion, confidant, and friend but her daughter. How the poor woman had come to marry the awful little Malacca Portuguese, after the separation from the father of her girl, and how that separation had been brought about, whether by death, which can sometimes be merciful, or by the merciless pressure of conventions, is a mystery to me. From the little which Stein, who knew so many stories, had let drop in my hearing, I am convinced that she was no ordinary woman. Her own father had been a white, a high official, one of the brilliantly endowed men who are not dull enough to nurse a success, and whose careers so often end under a cloud. I suppose she too must have lacked the saving dullness, and her career ended in Patusan. Our common fate. For where is the man, I mean a real sentient man, who does not remember vaguely having been deserted in the fullness of possession by some one or something more precious than life? Our common fate fastens upon the women with a particular cruelty. It does not punish like a master, but inflicts lingering torment as if to gratify a secret, unappeasable spite. One would think that, appointed to rule the earth, it seeks to revenge itself upon the beings that come nearest to rising above the trammels of earthly caution, for it is only women who manage to put at times into their love an element just palpable enough to give one a fright, an extraterrestrial touch. I ask myself, with wonder, how the world can look to them, whether it has the shape and substance we know, the air we breathe. Sometimes I fancy it must be a region of unreasonable sublimities, seething with the excitement of their adventurous souls, lighted by the glory of all possible risks and renunciations. However, I suspect there are very few women in the world, though of course I am aware of the multitudes of mankind and of the equality of sexes, in point of numbers, that is. But I am sure that the mother was as much of a woman as the daughter seemed to be. I cannot help picturing to myself these two, at first the young woman and the child, then the old woman and the young girl, the awful sameness and the swift passage of time, the barrier forest, the solitude and the turmoil round these two lonely lives, and every word spoken between them penetrated with sad meaning. There must have been confidences, not so much of fact, I suppose, as of innermost feelings, regrets, fears, warnings, no doubt, warnings that the younger did not fully understand till the elder was dead, and Jim came along. Then I am sure she understood much, not everything, the fear mostly, it seems. Jim called her by a word that means precious, in the sense of a precious gem, jewel. Pretty, isn't it? But he was capable of anything, He was equal to his fortune, as he, after all, must have been equal to his misfortune. Jewel, he called her, and he would say this as he might have said Jane, don't you know, with a marital, homelike, peaceful effect. I heard the name for the first time 10 minutes after I had landed in his courtyard, when, after nearly shaking my arm off, he darted up the steps and began to make a joyous, boyish disturbance at the door under the heavy eaves. "Jewel! Oh, Jewel! Quick! Here's a friend come!" And suddenly, peering at me in the dim veranda, he mumbled earnestly, "You know, this... no confounded nonsense about it. Can't tell you how much I owe to her. And so... you understand, I... exactly as if..." His hurried, anxious whispers were cut short by the flitting of a white form within the house, a faint exclamation, and a childlike but energetic little face with delicate features, and a profound, attentive glance, peeped out of the inner gloom, like a bird out of the recess of a nest. I was struck by the name, of course, but it was not till later on that I connected it with an astonishing rumour that had met me on my journey, at a little place on the coast about 230 miles south of the Patusan River. Stein's schooner, in which I had my passage, put in there to collect some produce, and going ashore I found to my great surprise that the wretched locality could boast of a third-class deputy assistant resident, a big, fat, greasy, blinking fellow of mixed descent, with turned-out, shiny lips. I found him lying extended on his back in a cane chair, odiously unbuttoned, with a large green leaf of some sort on top of his steaming head, and another in his hand which he used lazily as a fan. Going to Patusan? Oh yes, Stein's trading company. He knew. Had a permission. No business of his. It was not so bad there now, he remarked negligently, and he went on drawling. There's some sort of white vagabond has got in there, I hear. Eh? What you say? Friend of yours? So? Ah, then it was true. There was one of these verdammte... What was he up to? Found his way in, the rascal, eh? I had not been sure. Patusan. They cut throats there. No business of ours. He interrupted himself to groan. Phew! Almighty! The heat! The heat! Well, then, there might be something in the story, too, after all, and... He shut one of his beastly, glassy eyes. The eyelid went on quivering, while he leered at me atrociously with the other. Look here, says he mysteriously, if, do you understand, if he has really got hold of something very good, none of your bits of green glass, understand. I am a government official. You tell the rascal, eh? What, friend of yours? He continued wallowing calmly in the chair. You said so, that's just it, and I am pleased to give you the hint. I suppose you too would like to get something out of it. Don't interrupt. You just tell him I've heard the tale, but to my government I have made no report. Not yet, see? But I make a report. Eh? Tell him to come to me, if they let him get alive out of the country. He had better look out for himself, eh? I promise to ask no questions. On the quiet. You understand? You too. You shall get something from me. Small commission for the trouble. Don't interrupt. I am a government official, and make no report. That's business. Understand? I know some good people that will buy anything worth having, and can give him more money than the scoundrel ever saw in his life. I know his sort. He fixed me steadfastly with both his eyes open, while I stood over him utterly amazed, and asking myself whether he was mad or drunk. He perspired, puffed, moaning feebly, and scratching himself with such horrible composure that I could not bear the sight long enough to find out. Next day, talking casually with the people of the little native court of the place, I discovered that a story was travelling slowly down the coast about a mysterious white man in Patusan who had got hold of an extraordinary gem, namely an emerald of an enormous size and altogether priceless. The emerald seems to appeal more to the Eastern imagination than any other precious stone. The white man had obtained it, I was told, partly by the exercise of his wonderful strength and partly by cunning, from the ruler of a distant country, whence he had fled instantly, arriving at Patusan in utmost distress, but frightening the people by his extreme ferocity, which nothing seemed able to subdue. Most of my informants were of the opinion that the stone was probably unlucky, like the famous stone of the Sultan of Sukadana, which in old times had brought wars and untold calamities upon that country. Perhaps it was the same stone, one couldn't say. Indeed, the story of a fabulously large emerald is as old as the arrival of the first white men in the archipelago, and the belief in it is so persistent that less than 40 years ago there had been an official Dutch inquiry into the truth of it. Such a jewel, it was explained to me by the old fellow from whom I heard most of this amazing Jim myth, a sort of scribe to the wretched little Rajah of the place, such a jewel, he said, cocking his poor purblind eyes up at me, he was sitting on the cabin floor out of respect, is best preserved by being concealed about the person of a woman. Yet it is not every woman that would do. She must be young. He sighed deeply, and insensible to the seductions of love. He shook his head sceptically. But such a woman seemed to be actually in existence. He had been told of a tall girl whom the white man treated with great respect and care, and who never went forth from the house unattended. People said the white man could be seen with her almost any day. They walked side by side openly, he holding her arm under his, pressed to his side, thus, in a most extraordinary way. This might be a lie, he conceded, for it was indeed a strange thing for anyone to do. On the other hand, there could be no doubt she wore the white man's jewel concealed upon her bosom. End of chapters 27 and 28. Lord Jim, by Joseph Conrad, chapters 29 and 30. Chapter 29. This was the theory of Jim's marital evening walks. I made a third on more than one occasion, unpleasantly aware every time of Cornelius, who nursed the aggrieved sense of his legal paternity, slinking in the neighbourhood with that peculiar twist of his mouth, as if he were perpetually on the point of gnashing his teeth. But do you notice how 300 miles beyond the end of telegraph cables and mail-boat lines the haggard utilitarian lies of our civilization wither and die, to be replaced by pure exercises of imagination that have the futility, often the charm, and sometimes the deep hidden truthfulness of works of art? Romance had singled Jim for its own, and that was the true part of the story, which otherwise was all wrong. He did not hide his jewel. In fact, he was extremely proud of it. It comes to me now that I had, on the whole, seen very little of her. What I remember best is the even olive pallor of her complexion, and the intense blue-black gleams of her hair, flowing abundantly from under the small crimson cap she wore far back on her shapely head. Her movements were free, assured, and she blushed a dusky red. While Jim and I were talking she would come and go with rapid glances at us, leaving on her passage an impression of grace and charm and a distinct suggestion of watchfulness. Her manner presented a curious combination of shyness and audacity. Every pretty smile was succeeded swiftly by a look of silent, repressed anxiety, as if put to flight by the recollection of some abiding danger. At times she would sit down with us, and, with her soft cheek dimpled by the knuckles of her little hand, she would listen to our talk. Her big clear eyes would remain fastened on our lips as though each pronounced word had a visible shape. Her mother had taught her to read and write. She had learned a good bit of English from Jim, and she spoke it most amusingly, with his own clipping, boyish intonation. Her tenderness hovered over him like a flutter of wings. She lived so completely in his contemplation that she had acquired something of his outward aspect, something that recalled him in her movements, in the way she stretched her arm, turned her head, directed her glances. Her vigilant affection had an intensity that made it almost perceptible to the senses. It seemed actually to exist in the ambient matter of space, to envelop him like a peculiar fragrance, to dwell in the sunshine like a tremulous, subdued, and impassioned note. I suppose you think I am too romantic, but it is a mistake. I am relating to you these sober impressions of a bit of youth, of a strange, uneasy romance that had come in my way. I observed with interest the work of his, well, good fortune. He was jealously loved, but why she should be jealous, and of what, I could not tell. The land, the people, the forest were her accomplices, guarding him with vigilant accord, with an air of seclusion, of mystery, of invincible possession. There was no appeal, as it were. He was imprisoned within the very freedom of his power, and she, though ready to make a footstool of her head for his feet, guarded her conquest inflexibly, as though he were hard to keep. The very Tamb' Itam, marching on our journey upon the heels of his white lord, with his head thrown back, truculent and beweaponed like a janissary, with kriss, chopper, and lance, besides carrying Jim's gun, even Tamb' Itam allowed himself to put on the airs of uncompromising guardianship, like a surly, devoted jailer ready to lay down his life for his captive. On the evenings when we sat up late, his silent, indistinct form would pass and repass under the verandah with noiseless footsteps, or lifting my head I would unexpectedly make him out standing rigidly erect in the shadow. As a general rule he would vanish after a time without a sound, but when we rose he would spring up close to us as if from the ground, ready for any orders Jim might wish to give. The girl, too, I believe, never went to sleep till we had separated for the night. More than once I saw her and Jim through the window of my room come out together quietly and lean on the rough balustrade, two white forms very close, his arm about her waist, her head on his shoulder. Their soft murmurs reached me, penetrating, tender, with a calm, sad note in the stillness of the night, like a self-communion of one being carried on in two tones. Later on, tossing on my bed under the mosquito-net, I was sure to hear slight creakings, faint breathing, a throat cleared cautiously, and I would know that Tamb' Itam was still on the prowl. Though he had, by the favour of the white lord, a house in the compound, had taken wife, and had lately been blessed with a child, I believe that, during my stay at all events, he slept on the verandah every night. It was very difficult to make this faithful and grim retainer talk. Even Jim himself was answered in jerky, short sentences, under protest as it were. Talking, he seemed to imply, was no business of his. The longest speech I heard him volunteer was one morning, when, suddenly extending his hand toward the courtyard, he pointed at Cornelius and said, "Here comes the Nazarene." I don't think he was addressing me, though I stood at his side. His object seemed rather to awaken the indignant attention of the universe. Some muttered allusions, which followed, to dogs and the smell of roast meat, struck me as singularly felicitous. The courtyard, a large square space, was one torrid blaze of sunshine, and bathed in intense light Cornelius was creeping across in full view, with an inexpressible effect of stealthiness, of dark and secret slinking. He reminded one of everything that is unsavoury. His slow, laborious walk resembled the creeping of a repulsive beetle, the legs alone moving with horrid industry while the body glided evenly. I suppose he made straight enough for the place where he wanted to get to, but his progress with one shoulder carried forward seemed oblique. He was often seen circling slowly amongst the sheds as if following a scent, passing before the verandah with upward stealthy glances, disappearing without haste round the corner of some hut. That he seemed free of the place demonstrated Jim's absurd carelessness or else his infinite disdain, For Cornelius had played a very dubious part, to say the least of it, in a certain episode which might have ended fatally for Jim. As a matter of fact, it had redounded to his glory, but everything redounded to his glory, and it was an irony of his good fortune that he, who had been too careful of it once, seemed to bear a charmed life. You must know that he had left Doramin's place very soon after his arrival, much too soon, in fact, for his safety, and of course a long time before the war. In this he was actuated by a sense of duty. He had to look after Stein's business, he said, hadn't he? To that end, with an utter disregard of his personal safety, he crossed the river and took up his quarters with Cornelius. How the latter had managed to exist through the troubled times I can't say. As Stein's agent, after all, he must have had Doramin's protection in a measure, and in one way or another he had managed to wriggle through all the deadly complications, while I have no doubt that his conduct, whatever line he was forced to take, was marked by that abjectness which was like the stamp of the man. That was his characteristic. He was fundamentally and outwardly abject, as other men are markedly of a generous, distinguished, or venerable appearance. It was the element of his nature which permeated all his acts and passions and emotions. He raged abjectly, smiled abjectly, was abjectly sad. His civilities and his indignations were alike abject. I'm sure his love would have been the most abject of sentiments, but can one imagine a loathsome insect in love? And his loathsomeness, too, was abject, so that a simply disgusting person would have appeared noble by his side. He has his place neither in the background nor in the foreground of the story. He is simply seen skulking on its outskirts, enigmatical and unclean, tainting the fragrance of its youth and its naiveness. His position in any case could not have been other than extremely miserable, yet it may very well be that he found some advantages in it. Jim told me he had been received at first with an abject display of the most amicable sentiments. The fellow apparently couldn't contain himself for joy, said Jim with disgust. He flew at me every morning to shake both of my hands. Confound him! But I could never tell whether there would be any breakfast. If I got 3 meals in 2 days I considered myself jolly lucky, and he made me sign a chit for $10 every week. Said he was sure Mr. Stein did not mean him to keep me for nothing. Well, he kept me on nothing as near as possible, put it down to the unsettled state of the country, and made as if to tear his hair out, begging my pardon 20 times a day, so that I had at last to entreat him not to worry. It made me sick. Half the roof of his house had fallen in, and the whole place had a mangy look, with wisps of dry grass sticking out, and the corners of broken mats flapping on every wall. He did his best to make out that Mr. Stein owed him money on the last 3 years' trading, but his books were all torn, and some were missing. He tried to hint that it was his late wife's fault. Disgusting scoundrel! At last I had to forbid him to mention his late wife at all. It made Jewel cry. I couldn't discover what became of all the trade goods. There was nothing in the store but rats, having a high old time amongst a litter of brown paper and old sacking. I was assured on every hand that he had a lot of money buried somewhere, but of course I could get nothing out of him. It was the most miserable existence I led there in that wretched house. I tried to do my duty by Stein, but I had other matters to think of. When I escaped to Doramin, old Tunku Allang got frightened and returned all my things. It was done in a roundabout way, and with no end of mystery, through a Chinaman who keeps a small shop here. But as soon as I left the Bugis quarter and went to live with Cornelius, it began to be said openly that the Rajah had made up his mind to have me killed before long. Pleasant, wasn't it? And I couldn't see what there was to prevent him if he really had made up his mind. The worst of it was, I couldn't help feeling I wasn't doing any good for either for Stein or for myself. Oh, it was beastly, the whole 6 weeks of it. Chapter 30. He told me further that he didn't know what made him hang on, but of course we may guess. He sympathized deeply with the defenceless girl at the mercy of that mean, cowardly scoundrel. It appears Cornelius led her an awful life, stopping only short of actual ill usage, for which he had not the pluck, I suppose. He insisted upon her calling him father, and with respect too, with respect, he would scream, shaking a little yellow fist in her face. I am a respectable man, and what are you? Tell me, what are you? You think I am going to bring up somebody else's child and not be treated with respect? You ought to be glad I let you. Come, say yes, father. No? You wait a bit. Thereupon he would begin to abuse the dead woman, till the girl would run off with her hands to her head. He pursued her, dashing in and out and round the house and amongst the sheds, would drive her into some corner where she would fall on her knees, stopping her ears, and then would stand at a distance and declaim filthy denunciations at her back for half an hour at a stretch. Your mother was a devil, a deceitful devil, and you too are a devil, he would shriek in a final outburst, pick up a bit of dry earth or a handful of mud, there was plenty of mud around the house, and fling it into her hair. Sometimes, though, she would hold out full of scorn, confronting him in silence, her face sombre and contracted, and only now and then uttering a word or two that would make the other jump and writhe with the sting. Jim told me these scenes were terrible. It was indeed a strange thing to come upon in a wilderness. The endlessness of such a subtly cruel situation was appalling, if you think of it. The respectable Cornelius, Inchi Nelius, the Malays called him, with a grimace that meant many things, was a much disappointed man. I don't know what he had expected would be done for him in consideration of his marriage, but evidently the liberty to steal, to embezzle, and appropriate to himself for many years and in any way that suited him best the goods of Stein's Trading Company. Stein kept the supply up unfalteringly as long as he could get the skippers to take it there, did not seem to him a fair equivalent for the sacrifice of his honourable name. Jim would have enjoyed exceedingly thrashing Cornelius within an inch of his life. On the other hand, the scenes were of so painful a character, so abominable, that his impulse would be to get out of earshot, in order to spare the girl's feelings. They left her agitated, speechless, clutching her bosom now and then with a stony, desperate face, and then Jim would lounge up and say unhappily, "Now come, really, what's the use? You must try to eat a bit," or give some such mark of sympathy. Cornelius would keep on slinking through the doorways, across the veranda and back again, as mute as a fish, and with malevolent, mistrustful, underhand glances. "I can stop his game," Jim said to her once. "Just say the word." And do you know what she answered? She said, Jim told me impressively, that if she had not been sure he was intensely wretched himself, she would have found the courage to kill him with her own hands. Just fancy that! The poor devil of a girl, almost a child, being driven to talk like that, he exclaimed in horror. It seemed impossible to save her, not only from that mean rascal, but even from herself. It wasn't that he pitied her so much, he affirmed. It was more than pity. It was as if he had something on his conscience while that life went on. To leave the house would have appeared a base desertion. He had understood at last that there was nothing to expect from a longer stay, neither accounts nor money nor truth of any sort. But he stayed on, exasperating Cornelius to the verge, I won't say of insanity, but almost of courage. Meantime he felt all sorts of dangers gathering obscurely about him. Doramin had sent over twice a trusty servant to tell him seriously that he could do nothing for his safety unless he would recross the river again and live amongst the Bugis as at first. People of every condition used to call, often in the dead of night, in order to disclose to him plots for his assassination. He was to be poisoned. He was to be stabbed in the bath-house. Arrangements were being made to have him shot from a boat on the river. Each of these informants professed himself to be his very good friend. It was enough, he told me, to spoil a fellow's rest for ever. Something of the kind was extremely possible, nay, probable, but the lying warnings gave him only the sense of a deadly scheming going on all around him, on all sides in the dark. Nothing more calculated to shake the best of nerve. Finally, one night, Cornelius himself, with a great apparatus of alarm and secrecy, unfolded in solemn wheedling tones a little plan wherein for $100, or even for 80, let's say 80, he, Cornelius, would procure a trustworthy man to smuggle Jim out of the river all safe. There was nothing else for it now, if Jim cared a pin for his life. What's $80? A trifle, an insignificant sum, while he, Cornelius, who had to remain behind, was absolutely courting death by this proof of devotion to Mr. Stein's young friend. The sight of his abject grimacing was, Jim told me, very hard to bear. He clutched at his hair, beat his breast, rocked himself to and fro with his hands pressed to his stomach, and actually pretended to shed tears. "Your blood be on your own head," he squeaked at last, and rushed out. It is a curious question how far Cornelius was sincere in that performance. Jim confessed to me that he did not sleep a wink after the fellow had gone. He lay on his back on a thin mat spread over bamboo flooring, trying idly to make out the bare rafters, and listening to the rustlings in the torn thatch. A star suddenly twinkled through a hole in the roof. His brain was in a whirl, but nevertheless it was on that very night that he matured his plan for overcoming Sherif Ali. It had been the thought of all the moments he could spare from the hopeless investigation into Stein's affairs, but the notion, he says, came to him then all at once. He could see, as it were, the guns mounted on the top of the hill. He got very hot and excited lying there. Sleep was out of the question more than ever. He jumped up and went out barefoot on the veranda. Walking silently, he came upon the girl, motionless against the wall, as if on watch. In his then state of mind it did not surprise him to see her up, nor yet to hear her ask in an anxious whisper where Cornelius could be. He simply said he did not know. She moaned a little and peered into the campong. Everything was very quiet. He was possessed by his new idea, and so full of it that he could not help telling the girl all about it at once. She listened, clapped her hands lightly, whispered softly her admiration, but was evidently on the alert all the time. It seems he had been used to make a confidant of her all along, and that she on her part could and did give him a lot of useful hints as to Patusan affairs, there is no doubt. He assured me more than once that he had never found himself the worse for her advice. At any rate, he was proceeding to explain his plan fully to her then and there, when she pressed his arm once and vanished from his side. Then Cornelius appeared from somewhere, and, perceiving Jim, ducked sideways, as though he had been shot at, and afterwards stood very still in the dusk. At last he came forward prudently, like a suspicious cat. "There were some fishermen there, with fish," he said in a shaky voice. "To sell fish, you understand." It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning, a likely time for anybody to hawk fish about. Jim, however, let the statement pass, and did not give it a second thought. Other matters occupied his mind, and besides he had neither seen nor heard anything. He contented himself by saying, "Oh," absently, got a drink of water out of a pitcher standing there, and leaving Cornelius a prey to some inexplicable emotion that made him embrace with both arms the worm-eaten rail of the veranda as if his legs had failed, went in again and lay down on his mat to think. By and by he heard stealthy footsteps. They stopped. A voice whispered tremulously through the wall. "Are you asleep?" "No. What is it?" he answered briskly, and there was an abrupt movement outside, and then all was still, as if the whisperer had been startled. Extremely annoyed at this, Jim came out impetuously, and Cornelius, with a faint shriek, fled along the veranda as far as the steps, where he hung on to the broken banister. Very puzzled, Jim called out to him from the distance to know what the devil he meant. Have you given your consideration to what I spoke to you about?" asked Cornelius, pronouncing the words with difficulty, like a man in the cold fit of a fever. "No," shouted Jim in a passion. "I have not, and I don't intend to. I am going to live here, in Patusan." "You shall die here," answered Cornelius, still shaking violently, and in a sort of expiring voice. The whole performance was so absurd and provoking that Jim didn't know whether he ought to be amused or angry. "Not till I've seen you tucked away, you bet," he called out, exasperated yet ready to laugh. Half seriously, being excited with his own thoughts, you know, he went on shouting, "Nothing can touch me. You can do your damnedest." Somehow the shadowy Cornelius, far off there, seemed to be the hateful embodiment of all the annoyances and difficulties he had found in his path. He let himself go. His nerves had been overwrought for days, and called him many pretty names swindler, liar, sorry rascal, in fact carried on in an extraordinary way. He admits he passed all bounds, that he was quite beside himself, defied all Patusan to scare him away, declared he would make them all dance to his own tune yet, and so on, in a menacing, boasting strain. Perfectly bombastic and ridiculous, he said. His ears burned at the bare recollection. Must have been off his chump in some way. The girl who was sitting with us nodded her little head at me quickly, frowned faintly, and said, "I heard him," with a childlike solemnity. He laughed and blushed. What stopped him at last, he said, was the silence, the complete death-like silence of the indistinct figure far over there, that seemed to hang collapsed, doubled over the rail in a weird immobility. He came to his senses, and ceasing suddenly, wondered greatly at himself. He watched for a while. Not a stir, not a sound. "Exactly as if the chap had died while I had been making all that noise," he said. He was so ashamed of himself that he went indoors in a hurry, without another word, and flung himself down again. The row seemed to have done him good, though, because he went to sleep for the rest of the night like a baby. Hadn't slept like that for weeks. "But I didn't sleep," struck in the girl, one elbow on the table and nursing her cheek. "I watched." Her big eyes flashed, rolling a little, and then she fixed them on my face intently. End of chapters 29 and 30. Lord Jim, by Joseph Conrad, chapters 31 and 32. Chapter 31. You may imagine with what interest I listened. All these details were perceived to have some significance 24 hours later. In the morning Cornelius made no allusion to the events of the night. "I suppose you will come back to my poor house," he muttered surlily, slinking up just as Jim was entering the canoe to go over to Doramin's campong. Jim only nodded without looking at him. "You'll find it good fun, no doubt," muttered the other in a sour tone. Jim spent the day with the old nakhoda, preaching the necessity of vigorous action to the principal men of the Bugis community, who had been summoned for a big talk. He remembered with pleasure how very eloquent and persuasive he had been. "I managed to put some backbone into them that time, and no mistake," he said. Sherif Ali's last raid had swept the outskirts of the settlement, and some women belonging to the town had been carried off to the stockade. Sherif Ali's emissaries had been seen in the market-place the day before, strutting about haughtily in white cloaks and boasting of the Rajah's friendship for their master. One of them stood forward in the shade of a tree, and, leaning on the long barrel of a rifle, exhorted the people to prayer and repentance, advising them to kill all strangers in their midst, some of whom, he said, were infidels, and others even worse, children of Satan in the guise of Moslems. It was reported that several of the Rajah's people amongst the listeners had loudly expressed their approbation. The terror amongst the common people was intense. Jim, immensely pleased with his day's work, crossed the river again before sunset. As he had got the bogies irretrievably committed to action and had made himself responsible for success on his own head, he was so elated that in the lightness of his heart he absolutely tried to be civil with Cornelius. But Cornelius became wildly jovial in response, and it was almost more than he could stand, he says, to hear his little squeaks of false laughter, to see him wriggle and blink, and suddenly catch hold of his chin and crouch low over the table with a distracted stare. The girl did not show herself, and Jim retired early. When he rose to say good night, Cornelius jumped up, knocking his chair over, and ducked out of sight as if to pick up something he had dropped. His good night came huskily from under the table. Jim was amazed to see him emerge with a dropping jaw and staring, stupidly frightened eyes. He clutched the edge of the table. "What's the matter? Are you unwell?" asked Jim. "Yes, yes, yes, a great colic in my stomach," says the other, and it is Jim's opinion that it was perfectly true. If so, it was, in view of his contemplated action, an abject sign of a still imperfect callousness for which he must be given all due credit. Be it as it may, Jim's slumbers were disturbed by a dream of heavens like brass resounding with a great voice, which called upon him to awake, awake, so loud that, notwithstanding his desperate determination to sleep on, he did wake up in reality. The glare of a red sputtering conflagration going on in mid-air fell on his eyes. Coils of black thick smoke curved round the head of some apparition, some unearthly being, all in white, with a severe, drawn, anxious face. After a second or so he recognized the girl. She was holding a damar torch at arm's length aloft, and in a persistent, urgent monotone she was repeating, "Get up! Get up! Get up!" Suddenly he leaped to his feet. At once she put into his hand a revolver, his own revolver, which had been hanging on a nail, but loaded this time. He gripped it in silence, bewildered, blinking in the light. He wondered what he could do for her. She asked rapidly and very low, "Can you face 4 men with this?" He laughed while narrating this part of the recollection of his polite alacrity. It seems he made a great display of it. "Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Command me." He was not properly awake, and had a notion of being very civil in these extraordinary circumstances, of showing his unquestioning devoted readiness. She left the room, and he followed her. In the passage they disturbed an old hag who did the casual cooking of the household, though she was so decrepit as to be hardly able to understand human speech. She got up and hobbled behind them, mumbling toothlessly. On the veranda a hammock of sailcloth belonging to Cornelius swayed lightly to the touch of Jim's elbow. It was empty. The Patusan establishment, like all posts of Stein's trading company, had originally consisted of 4 buildings. 2 of them were represented by 2 heaps of sticks, broken bamboos, rotten thatch, over which the 4 corner posts of hardwood leaned sadly at different angles. The principal storeroom, however, stood yet, facing the agent's house. It was an oblong hut, built of mud and clay. It had at one end a wide door of stout planking, which so far had not come off the hinges, and in one of the side walls there was a square aperture, a sort of window, with 3 wooden bars. Before descending the few steps the girl turned her face over her shoulder and said quickly, "You were to be set upon while you slept." Jim tells me he experienced a sense of deception. It was the old story. He was weary of these attempts upon his life. He had had his fill of these alarms. He was sick of them. He assured me he was angry with the girl for deceiving him. He had followed her under the impression that it was she who wanted his help, and now he had half a mind to turn on his heel and go back in disgust. "Do you know," he commented profoundly, "I rather think I was not quite myself for whole weeks on end about that time." "Oh, yes, you were, though," I couldn't help contradicting. But she moved on swiftly, and he followed her into the courtyard. All its fences had fallen in a long time ago. The neighbours' buffaloes would pace in the morning across the open space, snorting profoundly, without haste. The very jungle was invading it already. Jim and the girl stopped in the rank grass. The light in which they stood made a dense blackness all round, and only above their heads there was an opulent glitter of stars. He told me it was a beautiful night, quite cool, with a little stir of breeze from the river. It seems he noticed its friendly beauty. Remember, this is a love story I am telling you now. A lovely night seemed to breathe on them a soft caress. The flame of the torch streamed now and then with a fluttering noise like a flag, and for a time this was the only sound. "They are in the storeroom waiting," whispered the girl. "They are waiting for the signal." "Who's to give it?" he asked. She shook the torch, which blazed up after a shower of sparks. "Only you have been sleeping so restlessly," she continued in a murmur. "I watched your sleep too." "You!" he exclaimed, craning his neck to look about him. "You think I watched on this night only?" she said, with a sort of despairing indignation. He says it was as if he had received a blow on the chest. He gasped. He thought he had been an awful brute somehow, and he felt remorseful, touched, happy, elated. This, let me remind you again, is a love story. You can see it by the imbecility, not a repulsive imbecility, the exalted imbecility of these proceedings, this station in torchlight, as if they had come there on purpose to have it out for the edification of concealed murderers. If Sherif Ali's emissaries had been possessed, as Jim remarked, of a pennyworth of spunk, this was the time to make a rush. His heart was thumping, not with fear, but he seemed to hear the grass rustle, and he stepped smartly out of the light. Something dark, imperfectly seen, flitted rapidly out of sight. He called out in a strong voice, "Cornelius! Oh, Cornelius!" A profound silence succeeded. His voice did not seem to have carried 20 feet. Again the girl was by his side. "Fly," she said. The old woman was coming up. Her broken figure hovered in crippled little jumps on the edge of the light. They heard her mumbling and a light moaning sigh. "Fly," repeated the girl excitedly. "They are frightened now. This light, the voices, they know you are awake now. They know you are big, strong, fearless." "If I am all that," he began, but she interrupted him. "Yes, to-night. But what of to-morrow night? Of the next night? Of the night after? Of all the many, many nights? Can I always be watching?" A sobbing catch of her breath affected him beyond the power of words. He told me he had never felt so small, so powerless. And as to courage, what was the good of it, he thought? He was so helpless that even flight seemed of no use. And though she kept on whispering, "Go to Doramin, go to Doramin," with feverish insistence, he realized that for him there was no refuge from that loneliness which centupled all his dangers, except in her. "I thought," he said to me, "that if I went away from her it would be the end of everything somehow." Only, as they couldn't stop there for ever in the middle of that courtyard, he made up his mind to go and look into the storehouse. He let her follow him without thinking of any protest, as if they had been indissolubly united. "I am fearless, am I?" he muttered through his teeth. She restrained his arm. "Wait till you hear my voice," she said, and, torch in hand, ran lightly round the corner. He remained alone in the darkness, his face to the door. Not a sound, not a breath came back from the other side. The old hag let out a dreary groan somewhere behind his back. He heard a high-pitched, almost screaming call from the girl. "Now! Push!" He pushed violently. The door swung with a creak and a clatter, disclosing, to his intense astonishment, the low dungeon-like interior illuminated by a lurid, wavering glare. A turmoil of smoke eddied down upon an empty wooden crate in the middle of the floor. A litter of rags and straw tried to soar, but only stirred feebly in the draught. She had thrust the light through the bars of the window. He saw her bare round arm extended and rigid, holding up the torch with the steadiness of an iron bracket. A conical, ragged heap of old mats cumbered a distant corner almost to the ceiling, and that was all. He explained to me that he was bitterly disappointed at this. His fortitude had been tried by so many warnings, he had been for weeks surrounded by so many hints of danger, that he wanted the relief of some reality, of something tangible that he could meet. "It would have cleared the air for a couple of hours at least, if you know what I mean," he said to me. Jove! I had been living for days with a stone on my chest. Now at last he thought he would get hold of something, and nothing, not a trace, not a sign of anybody. He had raised his weapon as the door flew open, but now his arm fell. "Fire! Defend yourself!" the girl outside cried in an agonizing voice. She, being in the dark and with her arm thrust into the shoulder through the small hole, couldn't see what was going on, and she dared not withdraw the torch now to run round. "There's nobody here," yelled Jim contemptuously. But his impulse to burst into a resentful, exasperated laugh died without a sound. He had perceived in the very act of turning away that he was exchanging glances with a pair of eyes in the heap of mats. He saw a shifting gleam of whites. "Come out!" he cried in a fury, a little doubtful, and a dark-faced head, a head without a body, shaped itself in the rubbish, a strangely detached head that looked at him with a steady scowl. Next moment the whole mound stirred, and with a low grunt a man emerged swiftly and bounded towards Jim. Behind him the mats, as it were, jumped and flew. His right arm was raised with a crooked elbow, and the dull blade of a kriss protruded from a fist held off a little above his head. A cloth wound tight round his loins seemed dazzlingly white on his bronze skin. His naked body glistened as if wet. Jim noted all of this. He told me he was experiencing a feeling of unutterable relief, of vengeful elation. He held his shot, he says, deliberately. He held it for the 10th part of a second, for 3 strides of the man, an unconscionable time. He held it for the pleasure of saying to himself, "That's a dead man." He was absolutely positive and certain. He let him come on because it did not matter. A dead man anyhow. He noticed the dilated nostrils, the wide eyes, the intent, eager stillness of the face, and then he fired. The explosion in that confined space was stunning. He stepped back a pace. He saw the man jerk his head up, fling his arms forward, and drop the kriss. He ascertained afterwards that he had shot him through the mouth, a little upwards, the bullet coming out high at the back of the skull. With the impetus of his rush the man drove straight on, his face suddenly gaping, disfigured, with his hands open before him, gropingly as though blinded, and landed with terrific violence on his forehead, just short of Jim's bare toes. Jim says he didn't lose the smallest detail of all this. He found himself calm, appeased, without rancour, without uneasiness, as if the death of that man had atoned for everything. The place was getting very full of sooty smoke from the torch, in which the unswaying flame burned blood-red without a flicker. He walked in resolutely, striding over the dead body, and covered with his revolver another naked figure outlined vaguely at the other end. As he was about to pull the trigger, the man threw away with force a short, heavy spear, and squatted submissively on his hams, his back to the wall and his clasped hands between his legs. "You want your life?" Jim said. The other made no sound. "How many more of you?" asked Jim again. "2 more, Tuan," said the man very softly, looking with big, fascinated eyes into the muzzle of the revolver. Accordingly 2 more crawled from under the mats, holding out ostentatiously their empty hands. Chapter 32. Jim took up an advantageous position and shepherded them out in a bunch through the doorway. All that time the torch had remained vertical in the grip of a little hand without so much as a tremble. The three men obeyed him, perfectly mute, moving automatically. He ranged them in a row. "Link arms," he ordered. They did so. "The first who withdraws his arm or turns his head is a dead man," he said. "March." They stepped out together, rigidly. He followed, and at the side the girl, in a trailing white gown, her black hair falling as low as her waist, bore the light. Erect and swaying, she seemed to glide without touching the earth. The only sound was the silky swish and rustle of the long grass. "Stop!" cried Jim. The river bank was steep. A great freshness ascended. The light fell on the edge of smooth dark water, frothing without a ripple. Right and left the shapes of houses ran together below the sharp outlines of the roofs. "Take my greetings to Sherif Ali, till I come myself," said Jim. Not one head of the three budged. "Jump!" he thundered. The three splashes made one splash. A shower flew up. Black heads bobbed convulsively and disappeared. But a great blowing and spluttering went on, growing faint, for they were diving industriously in great fear of a parting shot. Jim turned to the girl, who had been a silent and attentive observer. His heart seemed suddenly to grow too big for his breast, and choke him in the hollow of his throat. This probably made him speechless for so long, and after returning his gaze she flung the burning torch with a wide sweep of the arm into the river. The ruddy, fiery glare, taking a long flight through the night, sank with a vicious hiss, and the calm, soft starlight descended upon them unchecked. He did not tell me what it was he said when at last he recovered his voice. I don't suppose he could be very eloquent. The world was still, the night breathed on them, one of those nights that seemed created for the sheltering of tenderness. And there are moments when our souls, as if freed from their dark envelope, glow with an exquisite sensibility that makes certain silences more lucid than speeches. As to the girl, he told me she broke down a bit. Excitement, don't you know? Reaction. Deucedly tired she must have been, and all that kind of thing. And hang it all, she was fond of me, don't you see? I too. Didn't know, of course. Never entered my head. Then he got up and began to walk about in some agitation. I love her dearly. More than I can tell. Of course one cannot tell. You take a different view of your actions when you come to understand, when you are made to understand every day that your existence is necessary, you see, absolutely necessary, to another person. I am made to feel that. Wonderful. But only try to think what her life has been. It is too extravagantly awful, isn't it? And me finding her here like this, as you may go out for a stroll and come suddenly upon somebody drowning in a lonely dark place. Jove! No time to lose. Well, it is a trust, too. I believe I am equal to it. I must tell you that the girl had left us to ourselves some time before. He slapped his chest. Yes, I feel that, but I believe I am equal to all my luck. He had the gift of finding a special meaning in everything that happened to him. This was the view he took of his love affair. It was idyllic, a little solemn, and also true, since his belief had all the unshakable seriousness of youth. Some time after, on another occasion, he said to me, "I've been only 2 years here, and now, upon my word, I can't conceive of being able to live anywhere else. The very thought of the world outside is enough to give me a fright. Because, don't you see," he continued, with downcast eyes, watching the action of his boot, busied in squashing thoroughly a tiny bit of dried mud (we were strolling on the river bank), "because I have not forgotten why I came here. Not yet." I refrained from looking at him, but I think I heard a short sigh.
We took a turn or two in silence. "Upon my soul and conscience," he began again, "if such a thing can be forgotten, then I think I have a right to dismiss it from my mind. Ask any man here." His voice changed. "Is it not strange," he went on in a gentle, almost yearning tone, "that all these people who would do anything for me, can never be made to understand? Never! If you disbelieved me, I could not call them up. It seems hard, somehow. I am stupid, am I not? What more can I want? If you ask them who is brave, who is true, who is just, who is it they would trust with their lives, they would say, Tuan Jim. And yet they can never know the real truth." That's what he said to me on my last day with him. I did not let a murmur escape me. I felt he was going to say more, and come no nearer to the root of the matter. The sun, whose concentrated glare dwarfs the earth into a restless mote of dust, had sunk behind the forest, and the diffused light from an opal sky seemed to cast upon the world, without shadows and without brilliance, the illusion of a calm and pensive greatness. I don't know why, listening to him, I should have noted so distinctly the gradual darkening of the river, of the air, the irresistible slow work of the night settling silently on all the visible forms, effacing the outlines, burying the shapes deeper and deeper, like a steady fall of impalpable black dust. "Jove!" he began abruptly. "There are days when a fellow is too absurd for anything. Only I know I can tell you what it's like. I talk about being done with it, with the bally thing at the back of my head. Forgetting hang me if I know. I can think of it quietly. After all, what has it proved? Nothing. I suppose you don't think so." I made a protesting murmur. "No matter," he said. "I am satisfied. Nearly. I've got to look only at the face of the first man that comes along to regain my confidence. They can't be made to understand what is going on in me. What of that? Come, I haven't done so badly." "Not so badly," I said. "But all the same you wouldn't like to have me aboard your own ship, eh?" "Confound you!" I cried. "Stop this! Aha! You see!" he said, crowing, as it were, over me placidly. "Only," he went on, "you just try to tell this to any of them here. They would think you a fool, a liar, or worse. And so I can stand it. I've done a thing or two for them, but this is what they have done for me." "My dear chap," I cried, "you shall always remain for them an insoluble mystery." Thereupon we were silent. "Mystery," he repeated, before looking up. "Well, then, let me always remain here." After the sun had set, the darkness seemed to drive upon us, borne in every faint puff of the breeze. In the middle of a hedged path I saw the arrested, gaunt, watchful, and apparently one-legged silhouette of Tamb' Itam, and across the dusky space my eye detected something white moving to and fro behind the supports of the roof. As soon as Jim, with Tamb' Itam at his heels, had started upon his evening rounds, I went up to the house alone, and unexpectedly found myself waylaid by the girl, who had clearly been waiting for this opportunity. It is hard to tell you what it was precisely she wanted to wrest from me. Obviously it would be something very simple, the simplest impossibility in the world, as, for instance, the exact description of the form of a cloud. She wanted an assurance, a statement, a promise, an explanation, I don't know how to call it. The thing has no name. It was dark under the projecting roof, and all I could see were the flowing lines of her gown, the pale small oval of her face, with the white flash of her teeth, and, turned toward me, the big sombre orbits of her eyes, where there seemed to be a faint stir, such as you may fancy you can detect when you plunge your gaze to the bottom of an immensely deep well. What is it that moves there, you ask yourself? Is it a blind monster or only a lost gleam from the universe? It occurred to me, don't laugh, that all things being dissimilar, she was more inscrutable in her childish ignorance than the Sphinx propounding childish riddles to wayfarers. She had been carried off to Patusan before her eyes were open. She had grown up there. She had seen nothing, known nothing. She had no conception of anything. I asked myself whether she were sure that anything else existed. What notion she may have formed of the outside world is to me inconceivable. All that she knew of its inhabitants were a betrayed woman and a sinister pantaloon. Her lover also came to her from there, gifted with irresistible seductions. But what would become of her if he should return to these inconceivable regions that seemed always to claim back their own? Her mother had warned her of this with tears before she died. She had caught hold of my arm firmly, and as soon as I had stopped she had withdrawn her hand in haste. She was audacious and shrinking. She feared nothing, but she was checked by the profound incertitude and the extreme strangeness, a brave person groping in the dark. I belonged to this unknown that might claim Jim for its own at any moment. I was, as it were, in the secret of its nature and of its intentions, the confidant of a threatening mystery, armed with its power perhaps. I believe she supposed I could with a word whisk Jim away out of her very arms. It is my sober conviction she went through agonies of apprehensions during my long talks with Jim, through a real and intolerable anguish that might have conceivably driven her into plotting my murder had the fierceness of her soul been equal to the tremendous situation it had created. This is my impression, and it is all I can give you. The whole thing dawned gradually upon me, and as it got clearer and clearer I was overwhelmed by a slow, incredulous amazement. She made me believe her, but there is no word that on my lips could render the effect of the headlong and vehement whisper, of the soft, passionate tones, of the sudden breathless pause and the appealing movement of the white arms extended swiftly. They fell. The ghostly figure swayed like a slender tree in the wind. The pale oval of the face drooped. It was impossible to distinguish her features. The darkness of the eyes was unfathomable. Two wide sleeves uprose in the dark like unfolding wings, and she stood silent, holding her head in her hands. End of chapters 31 and 32.
Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 33 and 34. Chapter 33. I was immensely touched. Her youth, her ignorance, her pretty beauty, which had the simple charm and the delicate vigour of a wildflower, her pathetic pleading, her helplessness, appealed to me with almost the strength of her own unreasonable, unnatural fear. She feared the unknown as we all do, and her ignorance made the unknown infinitely vast. I stood for it, for myself, for you fellows, for all the world that neither cared for Jim nor needed him in the least. I would have been ready enough to answer for the indifference of the teeming earth, but for the reflection that he too belonged to this mysterious unknown of her fears, and that however much I stood for, I did not stand for him. This made me hesitate. A murmur of hopeless pain unsealed my lips. I began by protesting that I at least had come with no intention to take Jim away. Why did I come then? After a slight movement she was as still as a marble statue in the night. I tried to explain briefly friendship, business. If I had any wish in the matter, it was rather to see him stay. They always leave us, she murmured. The breath of sad wisdom from the grave, which her piety wreathed with flowers, seemed to pass in a faint sigh. Nothing, I said, could separate Jim from her. It is my firm conviction now. It was my conviction at the time. It was the only possible conclusion from the facts of the case. It was not made more certain by her whispering in a tone in which one speaks to oneself, "He swore this to me." "Did you ask him?" I said. She made a step nearer. "No, never." She had asked him only to go away. It was that night on the river bank after he had killed the man, after she had flung the torch in the water because he was looking at her so. There was too much light and the danger was over then, for a little time, for a little time. He said then he would not abandon her to Cornelius. She had insisted. She wanted him to leave her. He said that he could not, that it was impossible. He trembled while he said this. She had felt him tremble. One does not require much imagination to see the scene, almost to hear their whispers. She was afraid for him too. I believe that then she saw in him only a predestined victim of dangers which she understood better than himself. Though by nothing but his mere presence had he mastered her heart, had he filled all her thoughts, and had possessed himself of all her affections, she underestimated his chances of success. It is obvious that about that time everybody was inclined to underestimate his chances. Strictly speaking, he didn't seem to have any. I know this was Cornelius's view. He confessed as much to me in extenuation of the shady part he had played in Sherif Ali's plot to do away with the infidel. Even Sherif Ali himself, as it seems certain now, had nothing but contempt for the white man. Jim was to be murdered mainly on religious grounds, I believe, a simple act of piety, and in so far infinitely meritorious, but otherwise without much importance. In the last part of this opinion Cornelius concurred. "Honourable sir," he argued abjectly on the only occasion he managed to have me to himself, "Honourable sir, how was I to know? Who was he? What could he do to make people believe him? What did Mr. Stein mean sending a boy like that to talk big to an old servant? I was ready to save him for $80. Only $80. Why didn't the fool go? Was I to get myself stabbed for the sake of a stranger?" He grovelled in spirit before me with his body doubled up insinuatingly and his hands hovering about my knees, as though he were ready to embrace my legs. "What's $80? An insignificant sum to give to a defenceless old man ruined for life by a deceased she-devil." Here he wept. But I anticipate. I didn't that night chance upon Cornelius till I had had it out with the girl. She was unselfish when she urged Jim to leave her, and even to leave the country. It was his danger that was foremost in her thoughts, even if she wanted to save herself too, perhaps unconsciously. But then look at the warning she had. Look at the lesson that could be drawn from every moment of the recently ended life in which all her memories were centred. She fell at his feet. She told me so, there by the river, in the discreet light of the stars, which showed nothing except great masses of silent shadows, indefinite open spaces, and trembling faintly upon the broad stream made it appear as wide as the sea. He had lifted her up. He lifted her up, and then she would struggle no more. Of course not. Strong arms, a tender voice, a stalwart shoulder to rest her poor lonely little head upon. The need, the infinite need of all this for the aching heart, for the bewildered mind, the promptings of youth, the necessity of the moment. What would you have? One understands, unless one is incapable of understanding anything under the sun. And so she was content to be lifted up and held. "You know, Jove, this is serious. No nonsense in it," as Jim had whispered hurriedly, with a troubled, concerned face on the threshold of his house. I don't know so much about nonsense, but there was nothing light-hearted in their romance. They came together under the shadow of a life's disaster, like knight and maiden meeting to exchange vows among haunted ruins. The starlight was good enough for that story, a light so faint and remote that it could not resolve shadows into shapes, and show the other shore of a stream. I did look upon the stream that night, and from the very place. It rolled silent and black as Styx. The next day I went away, but I am not likely to forget what it was she wanted to be saved from when she entreated him to leave her while there was time. She told me what it was. Calmed. She was now too passionately interested for mere excitement. In a voice as quiet in the obscurity as her white half-lost figure, she told me, "I didn't want to die weeping." I thought I had not heard aright. "You did not want to die weeping?" I repeated after her. "Like my mother," she added readily. The outlines of her white shape did not stir in the least. "My mother had wept bitterly before she died," she explained. An inconceivable calmness seemed to have risen from the ground around us, imperceptibly, like the still rise of a flood in the night, obliterating the familiar landmarks of emotions. There came upon me, as though I had felt myself losing my footing in the midst of waters, a sudden dread, the dread of the unknown depths. She went on explaining that during the last moments, being alone with her mother, she had to leave the side of the couch to go and set her back against the door, in order to keep Cornelius out. He desired to get in, and kept on drumming with both fists, only desisting now and then to shout huskily, "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" In a far corner upon a few mats the moribund woman, already speechless and unable to lift her arm, rolled her head over, and with a feeble movement of her hand seemed to command, "No, no," and the obedient daughter, setting her shoulders with all her strength against the door, was looking on. "The tears fell from her eyes, and then she died," concluded the girl in an imperturbable monotone, which more than anything else, more than the white statuesque immobility of her person, more than mere words could do, troubled my mind profoundly with the passive, irremediable horror of the scene. She had the power to drive me out of my conception of existence, out of that shelter each of us makes for himself to creep under in moments of danger, as a tortoise withdraws within its shell. For a moment I had a view of a world that seemed to wear a vast and dismal aspect of disorder, while in truth, thanks to our unwearied efforts, it is as sunny an arrangement of small conveniences as the mind of man can conceive. But still it was only a moment. I went back into my shell directly. One must, don't you know? Though I seemed to have lost all my words in the chaos of dark thoughts, I had contemplated for a second or two beyond the pale. These came back too very soon, for words also belong to the sheltering conception of light and order which is our refuge. I had them ready at my disposal before she whispered softly, "He swore he would never leave me, when we stood there alone. He swore to me. And it is possible that you do not believe him?" I asked, sincerely reproachful, genuinely shocked. Why couldn't she believe? Wherefore this craving for incertitude, this clinging to fear, as if incertitude and fear had been the safeguards of her love? It was monstrous. She should have made for herself a shelter of inexpugnable peace out of that honest affection. She had not the knowledge, not the skill perhaps. The night had come on apace, it had grown pitch dark where we were, so that without stirring she had faded like the intangible form of a wistful and perverse spirit. And suddenly I heard her quiet whisper again, "Other men had sworn the same thing." It was like a meditative comment on some thoughts full of sadness, of awe. And she added, still lower if possible, "My father did."
She paused the time to draw an inaudible breath. Her father, too. These were the things she knew. At once I said, "Ah, but he is not like that." This, it seemed, she did not intend to dispute, but after a time the strange still whisper, wandering dreamily in the air, stole into my ears. "Why is he different? Is he better? Is he—" "Upon my word of honour," I broke in, "I believe he is." We subdued our tones to a mysterious pitch. Amongst the huts of Jim's workmen they were mostly liberated slaves from the Sherif's stockade somebody started a shrill drawling song. Across the river a big fire, at Doramin's I think, made a glowing ball completely isolated in the night. "Is he more true?" she murmured. "Yes," I said. "More true than any other man," she repeated in lingering accents. "Nobody here," I said, "would dream of doubting his word. Nobody would dare. Except you." I think she made a movement at this. "More brave?" she went on in a changed tone. "Fear will never drive him away from you," I said a little nervously. The song stopped short on a shrill note and was succeeded by several voices talking in the distance. Jim's voice too. I was struck by her silence. "What has he been telling you?" "He has been telling you something?" I asked. There was no answer. "What is it he told you?" I insisted. "Do you think I can tell you? How am I to know? How am I to understand?" she cried at last. There was a stir. I believe she was wringing her hands. "There is something he can never forget." "So much the better for you," I said gloomily. "What is it? What is it?" She put an extraordinary force of appeal into her supplicating tone. "He says he had been afraid. How can I believe this? Am I a mad woman to believe this? You all remember something. You all go back to it. What is it? You tell me. What is this thing? Is it alive? Is it dead? I hate it. It is cruel. Has it got a face and a voice, this calamity? Will he see it? Will he hear it? In his sleep, perhaps, when he cannot see me, and then arise and go? Ah, I shall never forgive him. My mother had forgiven, but I never. Will it be a sign? A call?" It was a wonderful experience. She mistrusted his very slumbers, and she seemed to think I could tell her why. Thus a poor mortal, seduced by the charm of an apparition, might have tried to wring from another ghost the tremendous secret of the claim the other world holds over a disembodied soul astray amongst the passions of this earth. The very ground on which I stood seemed to melt under my feet. And it was so simple too. But if the spirits evoked by our fears and our unrest have ever to vouch for each other's constancy before the forlorn magicians that we are, then I alone of us dwellers in the flesh, have shuddered in the hopeless chill of such a task. A sign, a call! How telling in its expression was her ignorance! A few words! How she came to know them, how she came to pronounce them, I can't imagine. Women find their inspiration in the stress of moments that for us are merely awful, absurd, or futile. To discover that she had a voice at all was enough to strike awe into the heart. Had a spurned stone cried out in pain it could not have appeared a greater and more pitiful miracle. These few sounds, wandering in the dark, had made their two benighted lives tragic to my mind. It was impossible to make her understand. I chafed silently at my impotence. And Jim too, poor devil! Who would need him? Who would remember him? He had what he wanted. His very existence probably had been forgotten by this time. They had mastered their fates. They were tragic.
Her immobility before me was clearly expectant, and my part was to speak for my brother from the realm of forgetful shade. I was deeply moved at my responsibility and at her distress. I would have given anything for the power to soothe her frail soul, tormenting itself in its invincible ignorance like a small bird beating about the cruel wires of a cage. Nothing easier than to say, "Have no fear." Nothing more difficult. How does one kill fear, I wonder? How do you shoot a spectre through the heart, slash off its spectral head, take it by its spectral throat? It is an enterprise you rush into while you dream, and are glad to make your escape with wet hair and every limb shaking. The bullet is not run, the blade not forged, the man not born; even the winged words of truth drop at your feet like lumps of lead. You require for such a desperate encounter an enchanted and poisoned shaft dipped in a lie too subtle to be found on earth. An enterprise for a dream, my masters. I began my exorcism with a heavy heart, with a sort of sullen anger in it too. Jim's voice, suddenly raised with stern intonation, carried across the courtyard, reproving the carelessness of some dumb sinner by the riverside. Nothing, I said, speaking in a distinct murmur. There could be nothing in that unknown world she fancied so eager to rob her of her happiness; there was nothing, neither living nor dead, there was no face, no voice, no power, that could tear Jim from her side. I drew breath, and she whispered softly, "He told me so." "He told you the truth," I said. "Nothing," she sighed out, and abruptly turned upon me with a barely audible intensity of tone. "Why did you come to us from out there? He speaks of you too often. You make me afraid. Do you want him?" A sort of stealthy fierceness had crept into our hurried murmurs. "I shall never come again," I said bitterly, "and I don't want him. No one wants him." "No one?" she repeated in a tone of doubt. "No one," I affirmed, feeling myself swayed by some strange excitement. "You think him strong, wise, courageous, great. Why not believe him to be true too? I shall go to morrow, and that is the end. You shall never be troubled by a voice from there again. This world you don't know is too big to miss him. You understand? Too big. You've got his heart in your hand. You must feel that. You must know that." "Yes, I know that," she breathed out, hard and still as a statue might whisper. I felt I had done nothing. And what is it that I had wished to do? I am not sure now. At the time I was animated by an inexplicable ardour, as if before some great and necessary task, the influence of the moment upon my mental and emotional state. There are in all our lives such moments, such influences coming from the outside, as it were, irresistible, incomprehensible, as if brought about by the mysterious conjunctions of the planets. She owned, as I had put it to her, his heart. She had that and everything else, if she could only believe it. What I had to tell her was that in the whole world there was no one who would ever need his heart, his mind, his hand. It was a common fate, and yet it seemed an awful thing to say of any man. She listened without a word, and her stillness now was like the protest of an invincible unbelief. What need she care for the world beyond the forests, I asked. From all the multitudes that peopled the vastness of that unknown there would come, I assured her, as long as he lived, neither a call nor a sign for him. Never. I was carried away. Never, never. I remember with wonder the sort of dogged fierceness I displayed. I had the illusion of having got the spectre by the throat at last. Indeed, the whole real thing has left behind the detailed and amazing impression of a dream. Why should she fear? She knew him to be strong, true, wise, brave. He was all that. Certainly. He was more. He was great, invincible, and the world did not want him. It had forgotten him. It would not even know him. I stopped. The silence over Patusan was profound, and the feeble dry sound of a paddle striking the side of a canoe somewhere in the midst of the river seemed to make it infinite. "Why?" she murmured. I felt that sort of rage one feels during a hard tussle. The spectre was trying to slip out of my grasp. "Why?" she repeated louder. "Tell me." And as I remained confounded, she stamped with her foot like a spoiled child. "Why? Speak." "You want to know?" I asked in a fury. "Yes," she cried. "Because he is not good enough," I said brutally. During the moment's pause I noticed the fire on the other shore blaze up, dilating the circle of its glow like an amazed stare, and contract suddenly to a red pin-point. I only knew how close to me she had been when I felt the clutch of her fingers on my forearm. Without raising her voice she threw it into an infinity of scathing contempt, bitterness, and despair. "This is the very thing he said. You lie." The last two words she cried at me in the native dialect. "Hear me out," I entreated. She caught her breath tremulously, flung my arm away. "Nobody, nobody is good enough," I began with the greatest earnestness. I could hear the sobbing labour of her breath, frightfully quickened. I hung my head. What was the use? Footsteps were approaching. I slipped away without another word. Chapter 34 Marlow swung his legs out, got up quickly, and staggered a little, as though he had been set down after a rush through space. He leaned his back against the balustrade and faced a disordered array of long cane chairs. The bodies prone in them seemed startled out of their torpor by his movement. One or two sat up as if alarmed. Here and there a cigar glowed yet. Marlow looked at them all with the eyes of a man returning from the excessive remoteness of a dream. A throat was cleared. A calm voice encouraged negligently. "Well?" "Nothing," said Marlow with a slight start. He had told her, that's all. She did not believe him. Nothing more. As to myself, I do not know whether it be just, proper, decent for me to rejoice or to be sorry. For my part, I cannot say what I believed. Indeed, I don't know to this day, and never shall probably. But what did the poor devil believe himself? Truth shall prevail, don't you know? Magna est veritas yes, when it gets a chance. There is a law, no doubt, and likewise a law regulates your luck in throwing of the dice. It is not justice, the servant of men, but accident, hazard, fortune, the ally of patient time, that holds an even and scrupulous balance. Both of us had said the very same thing. Did we both speak the truth, or did one of us, or neither? Marlow paused, crossed his arms on his breast, and in a changed tone. "She said we lied. Poor soul! Well, let's leave it to chance, whose ally is time, that cannot be hurried, and whose enemy is death, that will not wait. I had retreated, a little cowed, I must own. I had tried a fall with fear itself, and got thrown, of course. I had only succeeded in adding to her anguish the hint of some mysterious collusion, of an inexplicable and incomprehensible conspiracy to keep her for ever in the dark. And it had come easily, naturally, unavoidably, by his act, by her own act. It was as though I had been shown the working of the implacable destiny of which we are the victims and the tools. It was appalling to think of the girl whom I had left standing there motionless. Jim's footsteps had a fateful sound as he tramped by without seeing me in his heavy laced boots. "What, no lights?"
he said in a loud, surprised voice. "What are you doing in the dark, you two?" Next moment he caught sight of her, I suppose. "Hallo, girl!" he cried cheerily. "Hallo, boy!" she answered at once, with amazing pluck. This was their usual greeting to each other, and the bit of swagger she would put into her rather high but sweet voice was very droll, pretty, and childlike. It delighted Jim greatly. This was the last occasion on which I heard them exchange this familiar hail, and it struck a chill into my heart. There was the high sweet voice, the pretty effort, the swagger, but it all seemed to die out prematurely, and the playful call sounded like a moan. It was too confoundedly awful. "What have you done with Marlow?" Jim was asking. And then, "Gone down, has he? Funny I didn't meet him. You there, Marlow?" I didn't answer. I wasn't going in, not yet at any rate. I really couldn't. While he was calling me I was engaged in making my escape through a little gate leading out upon a stretch of newly cleared ground. No, I couldn't face them yet. I walked hastily with lowered head along a trodden path. The ground rose gently, a few big trees had been felled, the undergrowth had been cut down, and the grass fired. He had a mind to try a coffee plantation there. The big hill, rearing its double summit coal black in the clear yellow glow of the rising moon, seemed to cast its shadow upon the ground prepared for that experiment. He was going to try ever so many experiments. I had admired his energy, his enterprise, and his shrewdness. Nothing on earth seemed less real now than his plans, his energy, and his enthusiasm, and raising my eyes I saw part of the moon glittering through the bushes at the bottom of the chasm. For a moment it looked as though the smooth disk, falling from its place in the sky upon the earth, had rolled to the bottom of that precipice. Its ascending movement was like a leisurely rebound. It disengaged itself from the tangle of twigs. The bare contorted limb of some tree growing on the slope made a black crack right across its face. It threw its level rays afar as if from a cavern, and in this mournful eclipse-like light the stumps of felled trees uprose very dark. The heavy shadows fell at my feet on all sides, my own moving shadow, and across my path the shadow of the solitary grave perpetually garlanded with flowers. In the darkened moonlight the interlaced blossoms took on shapes foreign to one memory, and colours indefinable to the eye, as though they had been special flowers, gathered by no man, grown not in this world, and destined for the use of the dead alone. Their powerful scent hung in the warm air, making it thick and heavy, like the fumes of incense. The lumps of white coral shone round the dark mound like a chaplet of bleached skulls, and everything around was so quiet that when I stood still all sound and all movement in the world seemed to come to an end. It was a great peace, as if the earth had been one grave, and for a time I stood there thinking mostly of the living who, buried in remote places out of the knowledge of mankind, still are fated to share in its tragic or grotesque miseries. In its noble struggles too, who knows? The human heart is vast enough to contain all the world. It is valiant enough to bear the burden, but where is the courage that would cast it off? I suppose I must have fallen into a sentimental mood. I only know that I stood there long enough for the sense of utter solitude to get hold of me so completely that all I had lately seen, all I had heard, and the very human speech itself seemed to have passed away out of existence, living only for a while longer in my memory, as though I had been the last of mankind. It was a strange and melancholy illusion, evolved half consciously, like all our illusions, which I suspect only to be visions of remote unattainable truth seen dimly. This was indeed one of the lost, forgotten, unknown places of the earth. I had looked under its obscure surface, and I felt that when to morrow I had left it for ever,
It would slip out of existence, to live only in my memory till I myself passed into oblivion. I have that feeling about me now. Perhaps it is that feeling which has incited me to tell you the story, to try to hand it over to you, as it were, its very existence, its reality, the truth disclosed in a moment of illusion. Cornelius broke upon it. He bolted out, vermin-like, from the long grass growing in a depression in the ground. I believe his house was rotting somewhere near by, though I've never seen it, not having been far enough in that direction. He ran towards me upon the path. His feet, shod in dirty white shoes, twinkled on the dark earth. He pulled himself up and began to whine and cringe under a tall stove-pipe hat. His dried-up little carcass was swallowed up, totally lost in a suit of black broadcloth. That was his costume for holidays and ceremonies, and it reminded me that this was the fourth Sunday I had spent in Patusan. All the time of my stay I had been vaguely aware of his desire to confide in me, if he only could get me all to himself. He hung about with an eager, craving look on his sour, yellow little face, but his timidity had kept him back as much as my natural reluctance to have anything to do with such an unsavoury creature. He would have succeeded, nevertheless, had he not been so ready to slink off as soon as you looked at him. He would slink off before Jim's severe gaze, before my own, which I tried to make indifferent, even before Tamb' Itam's surly superior glance. He was perpetually slinking away. Whenever seen, he was seen moving off deviously, his face over his shoulder, with either a mistrustful snarl or a woebegone, piteous, mute aspect, but no assumed expression could conceal this innate, irremediable abjectness of his nature, any more than an arrangement of clothing can conceal some monstrous deformity of the body. I don't know whether it was the demoralisation of my utter defeat in my encounter with the spectre of fear less than an hour ago, but I let him capture me without even a show of resistance. I was doomed to be the recipient of confidences, and to be confronted with unanswerable questions. It was trying, but the contempt, the unreasoned contempt the man's appearance provoked, made it easier to bear. He couldn't possibly matter. Nothing matters, since I had made up my mind that Jim, for whom alone I cared, had at last mastered his fate. He told me he was satisfied. Nearly. This is going further than most of us dare. I, who have the right to think myself good enough, dare not. Neither does any of you here, I suppose. Marlow paused as if expecting an answer. Nobody spoke. Quite right, he began again. Let no soul know, since the truth can be wrung out of us only by some cruel little awful catastrophe. But he is one of us, and he could say he was satisfied. Nearly. Just fancy this. Nearly satisfied. One could almost envy him his catastrophe. Nearly satisfied. After this nothing could matter. It did not matter who suspected him, who trusted him, who loved him, who hated him, especially as it was Cornelius who hated him. Yet after all this was a kind of recognition. You shall judge of a man by his foes as well as by his friends, and this enemy of Jim was such as no decent man would be ashamed to own, without, however, making too much of him. This was the view Jim took, and in which I shared. But Jim disregarded him on general grounds. "My dear Marlow," he said, "I feel that if I go straight nothing can touch me. Indeed I do. Now you have been long enough here to have a good look round, and frankly, don't you think I am pretty safe? It all depends upon me, and by Jove I have lots of confidence in myself. The worst thing he could do would be to kill me, I suppose. I don't think for a moment he would. He couldn't, you know. Not if I were myself to hand him a loaded rifle for the purpose and then turn my back on him. That's the sort of thing he is. And suppose he would, suppose he could. Well, what of that?
I didn't come here flying for my life, did I? I came here to set my back against the wall, and I'm going to stay here." "Till you are quite satisfied," I struck in. We were sitting at the time under the roof of the stern of his boat. 20 paddles flashed like one, 10 on a side, striking the water with a single splash, while behind our backs Tamb' Itam dipped silently right and left, and stared right down the river, attentive to keep the long canoe in the greatest strength of the current. Jim bowed his head, and our last talk seemed to flicker out for good. He was seeing me off as far as the mouth of the river. The schooner had left the day before, working down and drifting on the ebb, while I had prolonged my stay overnight. And now he was seeing me off. Jim had been a little angry with me for mentioning Cornelius at all. I had not, in truth, said much. The man was too insignificant to be dangerous, though he was as full of hate as he could hold. He had called me "honourable sir" at every second sentence, and had whined at my elbow as he followed me from the grave of his late wife to the gate of Jim's compound. He declared himself the most unhappy of men, a victim crushed like a worm. He entreated me to look at him. I wouldn't turn my head to do so, but I could see out of the corner of my eye his obsequious shadow gliding after mine, while the moon, suspended on our right hand, seemed to gloat serenely upon the spectacle. He tried to explain, as I have told you, his share in the events of the memorable night. It was a matter of expediency. How could he know who was going to get the upper hand? "I would have saved him, honourable sir. I would have saved him for $80," he protested in dulcet tones, keeping a pace behind me. "He has saved himself," I said, "and he has forgiven you." I heard a sort of tittering, and turned upon him. At once he appeared ready to take to his heels. "What are you laughing at?" I asked, standing still. "Don't be deceived, honourable sir," he shrieked, seemingly losing all control over his feelings. "He save himself! He knows nothing, honourable sir. Nothing whatever. Who is he? What does he want here? The big thief! What does he want here? He throws dust into everybody's eyes. He throws dust into your eyes, honourable sir, but he cannot throw dust into my eyes. He is a big fool, honourable sir." I laughed contemptuously, and turning on my heel began to walk on again. He ran up to my elbow and whispered forcibly, "He's no more than a little child here, like a little child, a little child." Of course I didn't take the slightest notice, and seeing the time pressed because we were approaching the bamboo fence that glittered over the blackened ground of the clearing, he came to the point. He commenced by being abjectly lachrymose. His great misfortunes had affected his head. He hoped I would kindly forget what nothing but his troubles made him say. He didn't mean anything by it, only the honourable sir did not know what it was to be ruined, broken down, trampled upon. After this introduction he approached the matter near his heart, but in such a rambling, ejaculatory, craven fashion that for a long time I couldn't make out what he was driving at. He wanted me to intercede with Jim in his favour. It seemed, too, to be some sort of money affair. I heard time and time again the words "moderate provision, suitable present." He seemed to be claiming value for something, and he even went the length of saying with some warmth that life was not worth having if a man were to be robbed of everything. I did not breathe a word, of course, but neither did I stop my ears. The gist of the affair, which became clear to me gradually, was in this, that he regarded himself as entitled to some money in exchange for the girl. He had brought her up, somebody else's child, great trouble and pains, old man now, suitable, present. If the honourable sir would say a word. I stood still to look at him with curiosity, and fearful lest I should think him extortionate, I suppose, he hastily brought himself to make a concession.
In consideration of a suitable present given at once, he would, he declared, be willing to undertake the charge of the girl "without any other provision when the time came for the gentleman to go home." His little yellow face, all crumpled as though it had been squeezed together, expressed the most anxious, eager advance. His voice whined coaxingly. "No more trouble. Natural guardian. A sum of money." I stood there and marvelled. That kind of thing with him was evidently a vocation. I discovered suddenly in his cringing attitude a sort of assurance, as though he had been all his life dealing in certitudes. He must have thought I was dispassionately considering his proposal, because he became as sweet as honey. "Every gentleman made a provision when the time came to go home," he began insinuatingly. I slammed the little gate. "In this case, Mr. Cornelius," I said, "the time will never come." He took a few seconds to gather this in. "What?" he fairly squealed. "Why," I continued from my side of the gate, "haven't you heard him say so himself? He will never go home." "Oh, this is too much!" he shouted. He would not address me as honoured sir any more. He was very still for a time, and then without a trace of humility began very low. "Never go. Ah, he comes here, the devil knows from where. Comes here, devil knows why, to trample on me, till I die. Ah, trample!" He stamped softly with both feet. "Trample like this, nobody knows why, till I die." His voice became quite extinct. He was bothered by a little cough. He came up close to the fence and told me, dropping into a confidential and piteous tone, that he would not be trampled upon. "Patience, patience," he muttered, striking his breast. I had done laughing at him, but unexpectedly he treated me to a wild cracked burst of it. "Ha ha ha! We shall see, we shall see. What? Steal from me? Steal from me everything? Everything? Everything?" His head dropped on one shoulder. His hands were hanging before him lightly clasped. One would have thought he had cherished the girl with surpassing love, that his spirit had been crushed and his heart broken by the most cruel of spoliations. Suddenly he lifted his head and shot out an infamous word. "Like her mother. She is like her deceitful mother. Exactly. In her face too. In her face. The devil." He leaned his forehead against the fence, and in that position uttered threats and horrible blasphemies in Portuguese in very weak ejaculations, mingled with miserable plaints and groans, coming out with a heave of the shoulders as though he had been overtaken by a deadly fit of sickness. It was an inexpressibly grotesque and vile performance, and I hastened away. He tried to shout something after me, some disparagement of Jim, I believe. Not too loud, though. We were too near the house. All I heard distinctly was, "No more than a little child. A little child." End of chapters 33 and 34. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, chapters 35 and 36. Chapter 35. But next morning, at the first bend of the river shutting off the houses of Patusan, all this dropped out of my sight bodily, with its colour, its design, and its meaning, like a picture created by fancy on a canvas, upon which, after long contemplation, you turn your back for the last time. It remains in the memory motionless, unfaded, with its life arrested, in an unchanging light. There are the ambitions, the fears, the hate, the hopes, and they remain in my mind just as I had seen them, intense, and as if forever suspended in their expression. I had turned away from the picture, and was going back to the world where events move, men change, light flickers,
life flows in a clear stream, no matter whether over mud or over stones. I wasn't going to dive into it. I would have enough to do to keep my head above the surface. But as to what I was leaving behind, I cannot imagine any alteration. The immense and magnanimous Doramin, with his little motherly witch of a wife, gazing together upon the land and nursing secretly their dreams of parental ambition; Tunku Allang, wizened and greatly perplexed; Dain Waris, intelligent and brave, with his faith in Jim, and his firm glance and his ironic friendliness; the girl absorbed in her frightened and suspicious adoration; Tamb' Itam, surly and faithful; Cornelius leaning his forehead against the fence under the moonlight, I am certain of them. They exist as if under an enchanter's wand; but the figure round which all these are grouped, that one lives, and I am not certain of him. No magician's wand can immobilize him under my eyes. He is one of us. Jim, as I've told you, accompanied me on the first stage of my journey back to the world he had renounced, and the way at times seemed to lead through the very heart of untouched wilderness. The empty reaches sparkled under the high sun; between the high walls of vegetation the heat drowsed upon the water, and the boat, impelled vigorously, cut her way through air that seemed to have settled dense and warm under the shelter of lofty trees. The shadow of the impending separation had already put an immense space between us, and when we spoke it was with an effort, as if to force our low voices across a vast and increasing distance. The boat fairly flew; we sweltered side by side in the stagnant superheated air; the smell of mud, of mush, the primeval smell of fecund earth, seemed to sting our faces, till suddenly at a bend it was as if a great hand far away had lifted a heavy curtain, had flung open an immense portal. The light itself seemed to stir, the sky above our heads widened, a far off murmur reached our ears, a freshness enveloped us, filled our lungs, quickened our thoughts, our blood, our regrets, and straight ahead the forest sank down against the dark blue ridge of the sea. I breathed deeply. I revelled in the vastness of the opened horizon, in the different atmosphere that seemed to vibrate with the toil of life, with the energy of an impeccable world. This sky and this sea were open to me. The girl was right. There was a sign, a call in them, something to which I responded with every fibre of my being. I let my eyes roam through space, like a man released from bonds who stretches his cramped limbs, runs, leaps, responds to the inspiring elation of freedom. "This is glorious!" I cried, and then I looked at the sinner by my side. He sat with his head sunk on his breast, and said, "Yes," without raising his eyes, as if afraid to see writ large on the clear sky of the offing the reproach of his romantic conscience. I remember the smallest details of that afternoon. We landed on a bit of white beach. It was backed by a low cliff, wooded on the brow, draped in creepers to the very foot. Below us the plain of the sea, of a serene and intense blue, stretched with a slight upward tilt to the thread-like horizon drawn at the height of our eyes. Great waves of glitter blew lightly along the pitted dark surface, as swift as feathers chased by the breeze. A chain of islands sat broken and massive, facing the wide estuary, displayed in a sheet of pale glassy water, reflecting faithfully the contour of the shore. High in the colourless sunshine a solitary bird, all black, hovered, dropping and soaring above the same spot with a slight rocking motion of the wings. A ragged sooty bunch of flimsy mat hovels was perched over its own inverted image upon a crooked multitude of high piles the colour of ebony. a tiny black canoe put off from amongst them with two tiny men, all black, who toiled exceedingly, striking down at the pale water, and the canoe seemed to slide painfully on a mirror. This bunch of miserable hovels was the fishing village that boasted of the white lord's especial protection, and the two men crossing over were the old headman and his son-in-law. They landed and walked up to us on the white sand, lean, dark brown as if dried in smoke, with ashy patches on the skin of their naked shoulders and breasts. Their heads were bound in dirty but carefully folded headkerchiefs, and the old man began at once to state a complaint, voluble, stretching a lank arm, screwing up at Jim his old bleared eyes confidently. The Rajah's people would not leave them alone. There had been some trouble about a lot of turtles' eggs his people had collected on the islets there. And leaning at arm's length upon his paddle, he pointed with a brown skinny hand over the sea. Jim listened for a time without looking up, and at last told him gently to wait. He would hear him by and by. They withdrew obediently to some little distance, and sat on their heels with their paddles lying before them on the sand. The silvery gleams in their eyes followed our movements patiently, and the immensity of the outspread sea, the stillness of the coast passing north and south beyond the limits of my vision, made up one colossal presence watching us four dwarfs isolated on a strip of glistening sand. "The trouble is," remarked Jim moodily, "that for generations these beggars of fishermen in that village there had been considered as the Rajah's personal slaves, and that old rip can't get it into his head that—" He paused. "That you have changed all that," I said. "Yes, I've changed all that," he muttered in a gloomy voice. "You have had your opportunity," I pursued. "Have I?" he said. "Well, yes, I suppose so. Yes, I've got back my confidence in myself, a good name. Yet sometimes I wish... No, I shall hold what I've got. Can't expect anything more." He flung his arm out towards the sea. "Not out there, anyhow." He stamped his foot upon the sand. "This is my limit, because nothing less will do." We continued pacing the beach. "Yes, I've changed all that," he went on, with a sidelong glance at the two patient squatting fishermen. "But only try to think what it would be if I went away. Jove, can't you see it? Hell loose. No. To-morrow I shall go and take my chance of drinking that silly old Tunku Allang's coffee, and I shall make no end of fuss over these rotten turtles' eggs. No, I can't say enough. Never. I must go on for ever holding up my end, to feel sure that nothing can touch me. I must stick to their belief in me to feel safe and to... He cast about for a word, seemed to look for it on the sea. To keep in touch with... His voice sank suddenly to a murmur. With those whom perhaps I shall never see any more. With you, for instance. I was profoundly humbled by his words. "For God's sake," I said, "don't set me up, my dear fellow. Just look to yourself." I felt a gratitude and affection for that straggler whose eyes had singled me out, keeping my place in the ranks of an insignificant multitude. How little that was to boast of, after all! I turned my burning face away. Under the low sun, glowing, darkened, and crimson, like an ember snatched from the fire, the sea lay outspread, offering all its immense stillness to the approach of the fiery orb. Twice he was going to speak, but checked himself. At last, as if he had found a formula, "I shall be faithful," he said quietly. "I shall be faithful. he repeated without looking at me, but for the first time letting his eyes wander upon the waters, whose blueness had changed to a gloomy purple under the fires of sunset. Ah! He was romantic, romantic. I recalled some words of Stein. In the destructive element immerse. To follow the dream, and again to follow the dream, and always so, usque ad finem. He was romantic, but none the less true. Who could tell what forms, what visions, what faces, what forgiveness he could see in the glow of the west? A small boat, leaving the schooner, moved slowly with a regular beat of 2 oars towards the sandbank to take me off. "And then there's Jewel," he said out of the great silence of earth, sky, and sea, which had mastered my very thoughts, so that his voice made me start. "There's Jewel." "Yes," I murmured. "I need not tell you what she is to me," he pursued. "You've seen. In time she will come to understand. I hope so," I interrupted. "She trusts me too," he mused, and then changed his tone. "When shall we meet next, I wonder?" he said. "Never, unless you come out," I answered, avoiding his glance. He didn't seem to be surprised. He kept very quiet for a while. "Good bye, then," he said, after a pause. "Perhaps it's just as well." We shook hands, and I walked to the boat, which waited with her nose on the beach. The schooner, her mainsail set and jib sheet to the windward, curveted on the purple sea. There was a rosy tinge on her sails. "Will you be going home again soon?" asked Jim, just as I swung my leg over the gunwale. "In a year or so, if I live," I said. The forefoot grated on the sand. The boat floated, the wet oars flashed and dipped once, twice. Jim, at the water's edge, raised his voice. "Tell them," he began. I signed to the men to cease rowing, and waited in wonder. Tell who? The half submerged sun faced him. I could see its red gleam in his eyes that looked dumbly at me. "No, nothing," he said, and with a slight wave of his hand motioned the boat away. I did not look again at the shore until I had clambered on board the schooner. By that time the sun had set. The twilight lay over the east, and the coast, turned black, extended infinitely its sombre wall that seemed the very stronghold of the night. The western horizon was one great blaze of gold and crimson, in which a big detached cloud floated dark and still, casting a slaty shadow on the water beneath, and I saw Jim on the beach watching the schooner fall off and gather headway. The 2 half-naked fishermen had arisen as soon as I had gone. They were no doubt pouring the plaint of their trifling, miserable, oppressed lives into the ears of the white lord, and no doubt he was listening to it, making it his own. For was it not part of his luck, the luck from the word go, the luck to which he had assured me he was so completely equal? They too, I should think, were in luck, and I was sure their pertinacity would be equal to it. Their dark-skinned bodies vanished on the dark background long before I had lost sight of their protector. He was white from head to foot, and remained persistently visible, with the stronghold of the night at his back, the sea at his feet, the opportunity by his side, still veiled. What do you say? Was it still veiled? I don't know. For me that white figure in the stillness of coast and sea seemed to stand at the heart of a vast enigma. The twilight was ebbing fast from the sky above his head. The strip of sand had sunk already under his feet. He himself appeared no bigger than a child, then only a speck, a tiny white speck that seemed to catch all the light left in a darkened world. And suddenly I lost him. CHAPTER 36 With these words Marlow had ended his narrative, and his audience had broken up forthwith, under his abstract, pensive gaze. Men drifted off the verandah in pairs or alone, without loss of time, without offering a remark, as if the last image of that incomplete story, its incompleteness itself, and the very tone of the speaker had made discussion in vain and comment impossible. Each of them seemed to carry away his own impression, to carry it away with him like a secret. But there was only one man of all these listeners who was ever to hear the last word of the story. It came to him at home, more than 2 years later, and it came contained in a thick packet addressed in Marlow's upright and angular handwriting. The privileged man opened the packet, looked in, then, laying it down, went to the window. His rooms were in the highest flat of a lofty building, and his glance could travel afar beyond the clear panes of glass, as though he were looking out of the lantern of a lighthouse. The slopes of the roofs glistened, the dark broken ridges succeeded each other without end, like sombre uncrested waves, and from the depths of the town under his feet ascended a confused and unceasing mutter. The spires of churches, numerous, scattered haphazard, uprose like beacons on a maze of shoals without a channel. The driving rain mingled with the fading dusk of a winter's evening, and the booming of a big clock on a tower striking the hour rolled past in voluminous, austere bursts of sound, with a shrill vibrating cry at the core. He drew the heavy curtains. The light of his shaded reading lamp slept like a sheltered pool. His footfalls made no sound on the carpet. His wandering days were over. No more horizons as boundless as hope. No more twilights within the forests as solemn as temples in the hot quest for the ever undiscovered country over the hill, across the stream, beyond the wave. The hour was striking. No more, no more. But the opened packet under the lamp brought back the sounds, the visions, the very savour of the past, the multitude of fading faces, the tumult of low voices dying away upon the shores of distant seas under a passionate and unconsoling sunshine. He sighed and sat down to read. At first he saw 3 distinct enclosures, a good many pages closely blackened and pinned together, a loose square sheet of greyish paper with a few words traced in a handwriting he had never seen before, and an explanatory letter from Marlow. From this last fell another letter, yellowed by time and frayed on the folds. He picked it up and laying it aside, turned to Marlow's message, ran swiftly over the opening lines, and checking himself, thereafter read on deliberately, like one approaching with slow feet and alert eyes the glimpse of an undiscovered country. "I don't suppose you've forgotten," went on the letter. "You alone have showed an interest in him that survived the telling of the story, though I remember well you would not admit he had mastered his fate. You prophesied for him the disaster of weariness and of disgust with acquired honour, with the self-appointed task, with the love sprung from pity in youth. You had said you knew so well that kind of thing, its illusory satisfaction, its unavoidable deception. You said also, I call to mind, that giving up your life to them, them meaning all mankind with skins brown, yellow, or black in colour, was like selling your soul to a brute. You contended that that kind of thing was only endurable and endearing when based on a firm conviction in the truth of ideas racially our own, in whose name are established the order, the morality of an ethical progress. We want its strength at our backs, you had said. We want a belief in its necessity and its justice, to make a worthy and conscious sacrifice of our lives. Without it the sacrifice is only forgetfulness. The way of offering is no better than the way to perdition. In other words, you maintain that we must fight in the ranks or our lives don't count. Possibly. You ought to know, be it said without malice, you who have rushed into one or two places single-handed and came out cleverly without singeing your wings. The point, however, is that of all mankind Jim had no dealings but with himself, and the question is whether at the last he had not confessed to a faith mightier than the laws of order and progress. I affirm nothing. Perhaps you may pronounce after you've read. There is much truth, after all, in the common expression, under a cloud. It is impossible to see him clearly, especially as it is through the eyes of others that we take our last look at him. I have no hesitation in imparting to you all I know of the last episode that, as he used to say, had come to him. One wonders whether this was perhaps that supreme opportunity, that last and satisfying test for which I had always suspected him to be waiting, before he could frame a message to the impeccable world. You remember that when I was leaving him for the last time he had asked whether I would be going home soon, and suddenly cried after me, "Tell them." I had waited, curious I'll own, and hopeful too, only to hear him shout, "No, nothing." That was all then, and there will be nothing more. There will be no message unless such as each of us can interpret for himself from the language of facts that are so often more enigmatic than the craftiest arrangement of words. He made, it is true, one more attempt to deliver himself, but that too failed, as you may perceive if you look at the sheet of greyish foolscap enclosed here. He had tried to write. Do you notice the commonplace hand? It is headed "The Fort, Patusan." I suppose he had carried out his intention of making out of the house a place of defence. It was an excellent plan. A deep ditch, an earth wall topped by a palisade, and at the angles guns mounted on platforms to sweep each side of the square. Doramin had agreed to furnish him the guns, and so each man of his party would know there was a place of safety, upon which every faithful partisan could rally in case of some sudden danger. All this showed his judicious foresight, his faith in the future. What he called "my own people," the liberated captives of the Sherif, were to make a distinct quarter of Patusan with their huts and little plots of ground under the walls of the stronghold. Within he would be an invincible host in himself. The fort, Patusan. No date, as you observe. What is a number and a name to a day of days? It is also impossible to say whom he had in mind when he seized the pen. Stein, myself, the world at large, or was this only the aimless, startled cry of a solitary man confronted by his fate? "An awful thing has happened," he wrote before he flung the pen down for the first time. Look at the ink blot resembling the head of an arrow under these words. After a while he had tried again, scrawling heavily, as if with a hand of lead, another line. "I must now at once." The pen had spluttered, and that time he gave it up. There's nothing more. He had seen a broad gulf that neither eye nor voice could span. I can understand this. He was overwhelmed by the inexplicable. He was overwhelmed by his own personality, the gift of that destiny which he had done his best to master. I send you also an old letter, a very old letter. It was found carefully preserved in his writing case. It is from his father, and by the date you can see he must have received it a few days before he joined the Patna. Thus it must be the last letter he ever had from home. He had treasured it all these years. The good old parson fancied his sailor son. I've looked in at a sentence here and there. There is nothing in it except just affection. He tells his dear James that the last long letter from him was very honest and entertaining. He would not have him judge men harshly or hastily. There are 4 pages of it, easy morality and family news. Tom had taken orders. Carrie's husband had money losses. The old chap goes on equably trusting Providence and the established order of the universe, but alive to its small dangers and its small mercies. One can almost see him, grey-haired and serene in the inviolable shelter of his book-lined, faded, and comfortable study, where for 40 years he had conscientiously gone over and over again the round of his little thoughts about faith and virtue, about the conduct of life and the only proper manner of dying, where he had written so many sermons, where he sits talking to his boy over there on the other side of the earth. But what of the distance? Virtue is one all over the world, and there is only one faith, one conceivable conduct of life, one manner of dying. He hopes that his dear James will never forget that "who once gives way to temptation, in the very instant hazards his total depravity and everlasting ruin, therefore resolve fixedly never through any possible motives to do anything which you believe to be wrong." There is also some news of a favourite dog, and a pony which all you boys used to ride had gone blind from old age and had to be shot. The old chap invokes Heaven's blessing, the mother and all the girls then at home send their love. No, there is nothing much in that yellow frayed letter fluttering out of his cherishing grasp after so many years. It was never answered, but who can say what converse he may have held with all these placid, colourless forms of men and women peopling that quiet corner of the world, as free of danger or strife as a tomb, and breathing equably the air of undisturbed rectitude. It seems amazing that he should belong to it, he to whom so many things had come. Nothing ever came to them. They would never be taken unawares, and never be called upon to grapple with fate. Here they all are, evoked by the mild gossip of the father, all these brothers and sisters, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, gazing with clear unconscious eyes, while I seem to see him, returned at last, no longer a mere white speck at the heart of an immense mystery, but full of stature, standing disregarded amongst their untroubled shapes, with a stern and romantic aspect, but always mute, dark, under a cloud. The story of the last events you will find in the few pages enclosed here. You must admit it is romantic beyond the wildest dreams of his boyhood. And yet there is to my mind a sort of a profound and terrifying logic to it, as if it were our imagination alone that could set loose upon us the might of an overwhelming destiny. The imprudence of our thoughts recoils upon our heads. Who toys with the sword shall perish by the sword. This astounding adventure, of which the most astounding part is that it is true, comes on as an unavoidable consequence. Something of the sort had to happen. You repeat this to yourself while you marvel that such a thing could happen in the year of grace before last. But it has happened, and there is no disputing its logic. I put it down here for you as though I had been an eyewitness. My information was fragmentary, but I fitted the pieces together, and there is enough of them to make an intelligible picture. I wonder how he would have related it himself. He had confided so much in me that at times it seems as though he must come in presently and tell the story in his own words, in his careless yet feeling voice, with his off-hand manner, a little puzzled, a little bothered, a little hurt, but now and then by a word or phrase giving one of these glimpses of his very own self that were never any good for purposes of orientation. It's difficult to believe he will never come. I shall never hear his voice again, nor shall I see his smooth tan and pink face with a white line on the forehead, and the youthful eyes darkened by excitement to a profound and unfathomable blue. End of chapters 35 and 36.